Section 20, Europe and the Faith. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Europe and the Faith by Hilaire Belloc. Section 20, Chapter 5, continued. The Evidence. When we have to deal with a gap in history, and though none in Western European history is so strangely empty as this, yet there are very many minor ones which enable us to reason from their analogy. Two methods of bridging the gap are present to the historian. The first is research into such rare contemporary records as may illustrate the period. The second is the parallel of what has happened elsewhere in the same case, or better still, when that is possible, the example of what was proceeding in similar places and under similar circumstances at the same time. And there is a third thing. Both of these methods must be submitted to the criterion of common sense, more thorough and more absolute than the evidence of fuller periods. For when you have full evidence, even of a thing extraordinary, you must admit its truth. But when there is little evidence, guesswork comes in, and common sense is the correction of guesswork. If, for instance, I learn, as I can learn from contemporary records and from the witness of men still living, that at the Battle of Gettysburg infantry advanced so boldly as to bayonet gunners at their guns, I must believe it, although the event is astonishing. If I learn, as I can learn, that a highly civilized and informed government like that of the French in 1870, entering into a war against a great rival, had only the old muzzle-loading cannon when their enemies were already equipped with modern breech-loading pieces, I must accept it on overwhelming evidence, in spite of my astonishment. When even the miraculous appears in a record, if its human evidence is multiple, converging, and exact, I must accept it, or deny the value of human evidence. But when I am dealing with a period or an event for which evidence is lacking or deficient, then obviously it is a sound criterion of criticism to accept the probable and not to presuppose the improbable. Common sense and general experience are nowhere more necessary than in their application, whether in a court of law or in the study of history, to those problems whose difficulty consists in the absence of direct proof. Footnote. For instance, there is no contemporary account mentioning London during the last half of the 5th and nearly all the 6th century. Green, Freeman, Stubbs say, making it up as they go along, that London ceased to exist, disappeared. Then they assert, after a long period of complete abandonment, it was laboriously cleared by a totally new race of men, and as laboriously rebuilt on exactly the same site. The thing is not physically impossible, but it is so exceedingly improbable that common sense laughs at it. Remembering all this, let us first set down what is positively known from record with regard to the fate of Britain in the 150 years of the gap. We begin by noting that there were many groups of German soldiery in Britain before the pirate raids, and that the southwest was, whether on account of earlier pirate raids or on account of Saxon settlers, the descendants of Roman soldiers called the Saxon Shore, long before the imperial system broke down. Next we turn to documents. There is exactly one contemporary document professing to tell us anything at all of what happened within this considerable period. Exactly one document set down by a witness, and that document is almost valueless for our purpose. It bears the title De Excidio Britannia Liber Querulus. St. Gildas, a monk, was its author. The exact date of its compilation is a matter of dispute, necessarily so, for the whole of that time is quite dark, but it is certainly not earlier than 545. So it was written 100 years after the beginning of that darkness which covers British history for 150 years. Most of the Roman regulars had been called away for a continental campaign in 410. They had often so left the island before, but this time the troops sent out on expedition did not return. Britain was visited in 429 and 447 by men who left records. It was not until 597 that St. Augustine landed. St. Augustine landed only 50 years at the most after Gildas wrote his Liber Querulus, whereas the snapping of the links between the continent and southeastern Britain had taken place at least 100 years before. Well, it so happens that this book is, as I have called it, almost valueless for history. It is good in morals. Its author complains, as all just men must do in all times, of the wickedness of powerful men and of the vices of princes. It is a homily. The motive of it is not history, but the reformation of morals. In all matters extending to more than a lifetime before that of the writer, in all matters, that is, on which he could not obtain personal evidence, he is hopelessly at sea. He is valuable only as giving us the general impression of military and social struggles as they struck a monk who desired to make them the text of a sermon. He vaguely talks of Saxon auxiliaries from the North Sea being hired in the traditional Roman manner by some prince in Roman Britain to fight savages who had come out of the Highlands of Scotland and were raiding. He says this use of new auxiliaries began after the third consulship of Aetius, whom he calls Agitius, that is, after 446 AD. He talks still more vaguely of the election of local kings to defend the island from the excesses of these auxiliaries. He is quite as much concerned with the incursions of robber bands of Irish and Scotch into the civilized Roman province as he is with the few Saxon auxiliaries who were thus called in to supplement the arms of the Roman provincials. He speaks only of a handful of these auxiliaries, 3 boatloads, but he is so vague and ill instructed on the whole of this early period, 100 years before his time, that one must treat his account of the transaction as half legendary. He tells us that more numerous companies followed, and we know what that means in the case of the Roman auxiliaries throughout the empire, a few thousand armed men. He goes on to say that these auxiliaries, mutinying for pay, another parallel to what we should expect from the history of all the previous 100 years all over Europe, threatened to plunder the civil population. Then comes one sentence of rhetoric saying how they ravaged the countrysides in punishment for our previous sins, until the flames of the tumult actually licked the Western Ocean. It is all, and there is much more, just like what we have read in the rhetoric of the lettered men on the continent who watched the comparatively small but destructive bands of barbarian auxiliaries in revolt, with their accompaniment of escaped slaves and local ne'er-do-wells, crossing Gaul and pillaging. If we had no record of the continental troubles, but that of some one religious man using a local disaster as the opportunity for a moral discourse, historians could have talked of Gaul exactly as they talk of Britain on the sole authority of St. Gildas. All the exaggeration to which we are used to in continental records is here: the gleaming sword and the flame crackling, the destruction of cities which afterwards quietly continue an unbroken life, and all the rest of it. We know perfectly well that on the continent similar language was used to describe the predatory actions of little bodies of barbarian auxiliaries, actions calamitous and tragic no doubt, but not universal and in no way finally destructive of civilization. It must not be forgotten that St. Gildas also tells us of the return home of many barbarians with plunder, which is again what we should have expected. But at the end of this account he makes an interesting point which shows that, even if we had nothing but his written record to judge by, the barbarian pirates had got some sort of foothold on the eastern coast of the island. For after describing how the Romano-British of the province organized themselves under one Ambrosius Aurelianus and stood their ground, he tells us that sometimes the citizen, that is, the Roman and the civilized men, sometimes the enemy, were successful, down to the thorough defeat of some raiding body or other of the pagans at an unknown place which he calls Mons Badonicus. This decisive action, he also tells us, took place in the year of his own birth. Now the importance of this last point is that Gildas, after that day, can talk of things which he really knew. Let anyone who reads this page recall a great event contemporary with or nearly following his own birth, and see how different is his knowledge of it from his knowledge of that which came even a few years before. This is so today with all the advantages of full record. How much greater would be the contrast between things really known and hearsay when there was none. This defeat of the pagan pirates at Mount Badon Gildas calls the last but not the least slaughter of the barbarians, and though he probably wrote in the west of Britain, yet we know certainly from his contemporary evidence that during the whole of his own lifetime up to the writing of his book, a matter of some 44 years, there was no more serious fighting. In other words, we are certain that the little pagan courts settled on the east coast of Britain were balanced by a remaining mass of declining Roman civilization elsewhere, and that there was no attempt at anything like expansion or conquest from the east westward. For this state of affairs, remember, we have direct contemporary evidence during the whole lifetime of a man, and up to within at most 50 years, perhaps less, from the day when St. Augustine landed in Kent and restored record and letters to the east coast. We have more rhetoric and more homilies about the deserted cities and the wickedness of men and the evil life of the kings, but that you might hear at any period. All we really get from Gildas is 1. The confused tradition of a rather heavy predatory raid conducted by barbaric auxiliaries summoned from across the northern sea in true Roman fashion to help a Roman province against uncivilized invaders, Scotch and Irish. 2, which is most important, the obtaining by these auxiliary troops or their rulers, though in small numbers it is true, of political power over some territory within the island. 3, the early cessation of any racial struggles or conflict between Christian and pagan, or between barbarian and Roman, even of so much as would strike a man living within the small area of Britain, and the confinement of the new little pagan pirate courts to the east coast during the whole of the first half of the 6th century. Here let us turn the light of common sense onto these most imperfect, confused and few facts which Gildas gives us. What sort of thing would a middle-aged man writing in the decline of letters, and with nothing but poor and demonstrably distorted verbal records to go by, set down with regard to a piece of warfare if A. that man were a monk and a man of peace, B. his object were obviously not history but a sermon on morals, and C. the fighting was between the Catholic faith, which was all in all to the men of his time, and pagans? Obviously he would make all he could of the old and terrified legends of the time, long before his birth. He would get more precise as his birth approached, though always gloomy and exaggerating the evil, and he would begin to tell us precise facts with regard to the time he could himself remember. Well, all we get from St. Gildas is the predatory incursions of pagan savages from Scotland and Ireland, long before he was born. A small number of auxiliaries called in to help the Roman provincials against these. The permanent settlements of these auxiliaries in some quarter or other of the island. We know from other evidence that it was the east and southeast coast. And D, what is of capital importance, because it is really contemporary, the settling down of the whole matter, apparently during Gildas' own lifetime in the 6th century, from say 500 AD or earlier to say 545 or later. End of section 20. Section 21. Europe and the Faith. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Europe and the Faith by Hilaire Belloc. Section 21. Chapter 5 continued. I have devoted so much space to this one writer, whose record would hardly count in a time where any sufficient historical document existed, because his book is absolutely the only one contemporary piece of evidence we have upon the pirate or Saxon raiding of Britain. Footnote: the single sentence in Prosper is insignificant, and what is more, demonstrably false as it stands. There are interesting fragments about it in the various documents known to us collectively today as the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, but these documents were compiled many hundreds of years afterwards, and had nothing better to go on than St. Gildas himself, and possibly a few vague legends. Now, we happen to have in this connection a document which, though not contemporary, must be considered as evidence of a kind. It is sober and full, written by one of the really great men of Catholic and European civilization, written in a spirit of wide judgment, and written by a founder of history, the Venerable Bede. True, the Venerable Bede's ecclesiastical history was not produced until 300 years after the first raids of these predatory bands, not until nearly 200 years after St. Gildas, and not until 140 years after reading and writing and the full tide of Roman civilization had come back to Eastern Britain with St. Augustine. But certain fundamental statements of his are evidence. Thus, the fact that the Venerable Bede takes for granted permanent pirate settlements, established as regular, if small, states, all the way along the North Sea coast from the northern part of Britain in which he wrote, brought down to the central south by Southampton Water, is a powerful, or a rather conclusive argument in favor of the existence of such states some time before he wrote. It is not credible that a man of this weight would write as he does without solid tradition behind him. And he tells us that the settlers on this coast of Britain came from 3 lowland Frisian tribes, German and Danish, called Saxons, Jutes, and Angles. The first name, Saxon, was at that time the name of certain pirates inhabiting 2 or 3 small islands on the coasts between the Elbe and the Rhone. Footnote: the name has retained a vague significance for centuries, and is now attached to a population largely Slavonic and wholly Protestant south of Berlin, hundreds of miles from its original seat. Ptolemy puts these Saxons 200 years earlier just beyond the mouth of Elbe. The Romans knew them as scattered pirates in the North Sea, irritating the coast of Gaul and Britain for generations. The name later spread to a large island confederation, but that was the way with German tribal names. The German tribal names do not stand for fixed races or even provinces, but for chance agglomerations which suddenly rise and as suddenly disappear. The local term Saxon in the 5th and 6th century had nothing to do with the general term Saxon applied to all northwest of the Germanies 200 years and more afterwards. These pirates, then, provided small bands of fighting men under chieftains who founded small organized governments north of the Thames estuary, at the head of Southampton Water, and on the Sussex coast, when they may or may not have found, but more probably did find, existing settlements of their own people already established as colonies by the Romans. The chiefs very probably captured the Roman fiscal organization of the place, but seemed rapidly to have degraded society by their barbaric incompetence. They learned no new language, but continued to talk that of their original seat on the continent, which language was split up into a number of local dialects, each of which was a mixture of original German and adopted Greek, Latin, and even Celtic words. Of the Jutes we know nothing. There is a mass of modern guesswork about them, valueless like all such stuff. We must presume that they were an insignificant little tribe who sent out a few mercenaries for hire. But they had the advantage of sending out the first, for the handful of mercenaries whom the Roman British called into Kent were by all tradition Jutish. The Venerable Bede also bears witness to an isolated Jutish settlement in the Meon Valley near Southampton Water, comparable to the little German colonies established by the Romans at Bayeux in Normandy and near Rennes. The Angles were something more definite. They held that corner of land where the neck of Denmark joins the mainland of Germany. This we know for certain. There was a considerable immigration of them, enough to make their departure noticeable in the sparsely populated heaths of their district, and to make Bede record the traveller's tale that their barren country still looked depopulated. How many boatloads of them, however, may have come, we have of course no sort of record. We only know from our common sense that the number must have been insignificant compared with the local free and slave population of a rich Roman province. Their chiefs got hold of the land far above the Thames estuary in scattered spots all up the east coast of Britain as far as the Firth of Forth. There are no other authorities. There is no other evidence save St. Gildas, a contemporary, and 200 years after him, 300 after the first event, Bede. A mass of legend and worse nonsense called the Historia Brittonum exists, indeed, for those who consult it, but it has no relation to historical science nor any claim to rank as evidence. As we have it, it is centuries late, and it need not concern serious history. Even for the existence of Arthur, to which it is the principal witness, popular legend is a much better guide. As to the original dates of the various statements in the Historia Brittonum, those dates are guesswork. The legendary narrative as a whole, though very ancient in its roots, dates only from a period subsequent to Charlemagne, much more than a century later than Bede, and a time far less cultured. The life of St. Germanus, who came and preached in Britain after the Roman legions had left, is contemporary, and deals with events 60 years before St. Gildas' birth. It would be valuable if it told us anything about the pirate settlements on the coast, whether these were but the confirmation of older Roman Saxon garrisons or Roman agricultural colonies, or what. But it tells us nothing about them. We know that St. Germanus dealt in a military capacity with Picts and Scots, an ordinary barbarian trouble. But we have no hint at Saxon settlements. St. Germanus was last in Britain in 447, and it is good negative evidence that we hear nothing during that visit of any real trouble from the Saxon pirates who, at that very time, might be imagined, if legend were to be trusted, to be establishing their power in Kent. That ends the list of witnesses. That is all our evidence. Footnote. On such a body of evidence, less than a morning's reading, did Green build up for popular sale his romantic Making of England. To sum up, so far as recorded history is concerned, all we know is this: that probably some, but certainly only a few, of the Roman regular forces were to be found garrisoned in Britain after the year 410. That in the Roman armies there had long been Saxon and other German auxiliaries, some of whom could naturally provide civilian groups, and that Rome even planted agricultural colonies of auxiliaries permanently within the empire. That the south and east coasts were known as the Saxon shore even during imperial times. That the savages from Scotland and Ireland disturbed the civilized province cruelly. That scattered pirates who had troubled the southern and eastern coast for 2 centuries joined the Scotch and Irish ravaging bands. That some of these were taken in as regular auxiliaries on the old Roman model, somewhere about the middle of the 5th century. The conventional date is 445. That, as happened in many another Roman province, the auxiliaries mutinied for pay and did a good deal of bad looting and ravaging. Finally, that the ravaging was checked, and that the pirates were thrown back upon some permanent settlements of theirs established during these disturbances along the easternmost and southernmost coasts. Their numbers must have been very small compared with the original population. No town of any size was destroyed. Now, it is most important in the face of such a paucity of information to seize 3 points. First, that the ravaging was not appreciably worse, either in the way it is described or by any other criterion, than the troubles which the continent suffered at the same time, and which, as we know, did not there destroy the continuity or unity of civilization. Secondly, that the sparse raiders, pagan, as were also some few of those on the Continent, and incapable of civilized effort, obtained, as they did upon the Continent, notably upon the left bank of the Rhine, little plots of territory which they held and governed for themselves, and in which, after a short period, the old Roman order decayed in the incapable hands of the newcomers. But thirdly, and upon all this the rest will turn, the position which these less civilized and pagan small courts happened permanently to hold were positions that cut the link between the Roman province of Britain and the rest of what had been the united Roman Empire. This last matter, not numbers, not race, is the capital point in the story of Britain between 447 and 597. The uncivilized man happened by a geographical accident to have cut the communications of the island with its sister provinces of the empire. He was numerically as insignificant, racially as unproductive, and as ill provided with fruitful or permanent institutions as his brethren on the Rhine or the Danube. But on the Rhine and the Danube the empire was broad. If a narrow fringe of it was ruined, it was no great matter, only a retreat of a few miles. Those sea communications between Britain and Europe were narrow, and the barbarian had been established across them. The circulation of men, goods and ideas was stopped for 150 years because the small pirate settlements, mixed perhaps with barbarian settlements already established by the empire, had, by the gradual breakdown of the Roman ports, destroyed communication with Europe from Southampton Water right north to beyond the Thames. It seems certain that even the great town of London, whatever its commercial relations, kept up no official or political business beyond the sea. The pirates had not gone far inland, but with no intention of conquest, only of loot or continued establishment, they had snapped the bond by which Britain lived. Such is the direct evidence, and such our first conclusion on it. But of indirect indications, of reasonable supposition and comparison between what came after the pirate settlements and what had been before, there is much more. By the use of this secondary matter added to the direct evidence, one can fully judge both the limits and the nature of the misfortune that overtook Britain after the central Roman government failed, and before the Roman missionaries, who restored the province to civilization, had landed. We may then arrive at a conclusion and know what that Britain was to which the faith returned with St. Augustine. When we know that, we shall know what Britain continued to be until the catastrophe of the Reformation. The end of section 21. Section 22. Europe and the Faith. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Europe and the Faith by Hilaire Belloc. Section 22, Chapter 5, continued. I say that, apart from the direct evidence of St. Gildas and the late but respectable traditions gathered by the Venerable Bede, the use of other and indirect forms of evidence permits us to be certain of one or two main facts, and a method about to be described will enable us to add to these a half-dozen more. The whole may not be sufficient, indeed, to give us a general picture of the time, but it will prevent us from falling into any radical error with regard to the place of Britain in the future unity of Europe when we come to examine that unity as it re-arose in the Middle Ages, partly preserved, partly reconstituted by the Catholic Church. The historical method to which I allude and to which I will now introduce the reader may properly be called that of limitations. We may not know what happened between two dates, but if we know pretty well how things stood for some time before the earlier date and for some time after the later one, then we have two jumping-off places, as it were, from which to build our bridge of speculation and deduction as to what happened in the unexplored gap of time between. Suppose every record of what happened in the United States between 1862 and 1880 to be wiped out by the destruction of all but one insufficient document, and supposing a fairly full knowledge to survive of the period between the Declaration of Independence and 1862, and a tolerable record to survive of the period between 1880 and the present year. Further, let there be ample traditional memory and legend that a civil war took place, that the struggle was a struggle between North and South, and that its direct and violent financial and political effects were felt for over a decade. The student, hampered by the absence of direct evidence, might make many errors in detail, and might be led to assert as probably true things at which a contemporary would smile. But by analogy with other contemporary countries, by the use of his common sense and his knowledge of human nature, of local climate, of other physical conditions, and of the motives common to all men, he would arrive at a dozen or so general conclusions which would be just. What came after the gap would correct the deductions he had made from his knowledge of what came before it. What came before the gap would help to correct false deductions drawn from what came after it. His knowledge of contemporary life in Europe, let us say, or in Western territories which the war did not reach between 1862 and 1880, would further correct his conclusions. If he were to confine himself to the most general conclusions, he could not be far wrong. He would appreciate the success of the North and how much that success was due to numbers. He would be puzzled perhaps by the different positions of the abolitionist theory before and after the war, but he would know that the slaves were freed in the interval, and he would rightly conclude that their freedom had been a direct historical consequence and a contemporary effect of the struggle. He would be equally right in rejecting any theory of the colonization of the southern states by northerners. He would note the continuity of certain institutions, the non-continuity of others. In general, if he were to state first what he was sure of, secondly what he could fairly guess, his brief summary, though very incomplete, would not be off the rails of history. He would not be employing such a method to produce historical nonsense, as so many of our modern historians have done in their desire to prove the English people German and barbaric in their origins. This much being said, let me carefully set down what we know with regard to Britain before and after the bad gap in our records, the unknown 150 years between the departure of St. Germanus and the arrival of St. Augustine. We know that before the bulk of Roman regulars left the country in 410, Britain was an organized Roman province. Therefore we know that it had regular divisions, with a town as the center of each, many of the towns forming the sees of the bishops. We know that official records were kept in Latin, and that Latin was the official tongue. We further know that the island at this time had for generations past suffered from incursions of northern barbarians in great numbers over the Scottish border, and from piratical raids of seafarers, some Irish, others Germanic, Dutch and Danish in origin, in much less numbers. For the amount of men and provisions conveyable across a wide sea in small boats is highly limited. Within 4 years of the end of the 6th century, nearly 200 years after the cessation of a regular Roman government, missionaries, priests from the continent, acting on a Roman episcopal commission, land in Britain. From that moment writing returns, and our chronicle begins again. What do they tell us? First, that the whole island is by that time broken up into a number of small and warring districts. Secondly, that these numerous little districts, each under its petty king or prince, fall into 2 divisions. Some of these petty kings and courts are evidently Christian, Celtic-speaking, and by all their corporate tradition inherit from the old Roman civilization. The other petty kings and courts speak various Teutonic dialects, that is, dialects made up of jargon and of original German words and Latin words mixed. The population of the little settlements under these eastern knights spoke, apparently for the most part, the same dialects as their courts. Thirdly, we find that these courts and their subjects are not only mainly of this speech, but also in the mass pagan. There may have been relics of Catholicism among them, but at any rate the tiny courts and petty kinglets were pagan and Teutonic in speech. Fourthly, the divisions between these two kinds of little states were such that the decayed Christians were, when St. Augustine came, roughly speaking, in the west and centre of the island, the pagans on the coasts of the south and the east. All this tallies with the old and distorted legends and traditions, as it does with the direct story of Gildas, and also whatever of real history may survive in the careful compilation of legend and tradition made by the Venerable Bede. The first definite historical truth which we derive from this use of the method of limitation is of the same sort as that to which the direct evidence of Gildas leads us. A series of settlements had been effected upon the coasts of the Northern Sea and the eastern part of the Channel from, let us say, Dorsetshire or its neighbourhood, right up to the Firth of Forth. They had been effected by the North Sea pirates, and their foothold was good. Now let us use this method of limitations for matters a little less obvious, and ask first what were the limits between these two main groups of little confused and warring districts. Secondly, how far was either group coherent? Thirdly, what had survived in either group of the older order? And fourthly, what novel thing had appeared during the darkness of this century and a half or 2 centuries? Footnote: a century and a half from the very last Roman evidence, the visit of St. Germanus in 447, to the landings of St. Augustine, exactly 150 years later, 597. Nearly 2 centuries from the withdrawal of the expeditionary Roman army to the landing of St. Augustine, 410 to 597. Taking these 4 points seriatim. 1. Further inland than about a day's march from the sea or from the estuaries of rivers, we have no proof of the settlement of the pirates or the formation by them of local governments. It is impossible to fix the boundaries in such a chaos, but we know that the most of the country of Kent and the sea-coast of Sussex, also all within a raiding distance of Southampton Water and of the Hampshire, Avon, the maritime part of East Anglia and of Lincolnshire, so far as we can judge, the East Riding of Yorkshire, Durham, the coastal parts of at least Northumberland and the Lothians, were under numerous pagan kinglets whose courts talked this mixture of German and Latin words called Teutonic dialects. What of the Midlands? The region was a welter, and a welter of which we can tell very little indeed. It formed a sort of march or borderland between the two kinds of courts, those of the kinglets and chieftains who still preserved the tradition of civilization, and those of the kinglets who had lost that tradition. This mixed borderland tended apparently to coalesce, the facts of which we have to judge are very few, under one chief. It was later known, not under a Germanic or Celtic name, but under the low Latin name of Mercia, that is, the borderland. To the political aspect of this line of demarcation I will return in a moment. 2. As to the second question, what kind of cohesion was there between the western and the eastern sets of these vague and petty governments? The answer is that the cohesion was of the loosest in either case. Certain fundamental habits differentiated east from west, language for instance, and much more religion. Before the coming of St. Augustine, all the western and probably most of the central kinglets were Christians, the kinglets on the eastern coasts pagan. There was a tendency in the West apparently to hold together for common interests, but no longer to speak of one head. But note this interesting point. The West felt that some sort of common bond, called itself the Cymry, and only concerned the mountain land. It did not include, it carefully distinguished itself from, the Christians of the more fertile Midlands, South and East, which it called Logans. Along the East Coast there was a sort of tradition of common headship, very nebulous indeed, but existent. Men talked of chiefs of Britain, Bretwaldas, a word, the first part of which is obviously Roman, the second part of which may be Germanic or Celtic or anything, and which we may guess to indicate a titular headship. But, and this must be especially noted, There was no conscious or visible cohesion among the little courts of the east and southeast coasts. There was no conscious and deliberate continued pagan attack against the Western Christians as such in the end of the 6th century when St. Augustine landed, and no Western Celtic Christian resistance organized as such to the chieftains scattered along the eastern coast. Each kinglet fought with each, pagan with pagan, Christian with Christian, Christian and pagan in alliance against pagan and Christian in alliance, and the cross divisions were innumerable. You have petty kings on the eastern coast with Celtic names. You have Saxon allies in Celtic courts. You have Western Christian kings winning battles on the coasts of the North Sea, and Eastern kings winning battles nearly as far west as the Severn, etc., etc. I have said that it is of capital importance to appreciate this point, that the whole thing was a chaos of little independent districts, all fighting in a hodgepodge, and not a clash of warring races or tongues. It is difficult for us, with our modern experience of great and highly conscious nations, to conceive such a state of affairs. When we think of fighting and war, we cannot but think of one considerable conscious nation fighting against another similar nation, and this modern habit of mind has misled the past upon the nature of Britain at the moment when civilization re-entered the south and east of the island with St. Augustine. Maps are published with guesswork boundaries showing the frontiers of the Anglo-Saxon conquest at definite dates, and modern historians are fond of talking of the limits of that conquest being extended to such and such points. There were no frontiers. There was no conquest, either way, of east over west or west over east. There were no extending limits of eastern for western rule. There was no advance to Chester, no conquest of the district of Bath. There were no battles near Bath and battles near Chester, the loot of a city, a counter raid by the Westerners, and all the rest of it. But to talk of a gradual Anglo-Saxon conquest is an anachronism. The end of section 22. Section 23. Europe and the Faith. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Europe and the Faith by Hilaire Belloc. Section 23, Chapter 5, continued. The men of the time would not have understood such language, for indeed it has no relation to the facts of the time. The kinglet, who could gather his men from a day's march round his court in a lower Thames valley, fought against the kinglet who could gather his men from a day's march round his stronghold at Canterbury. A pagan, Teutonic-speaking Eastern kinglet would be found allied with a Christian, Celtic-speaking Western kinglet, and his Christian followers and the allies would march indifferently against another Christian or another pagan. There was indeed later a westward movement in language and habit which I shall mention, that was the work of the Church. So far as warfare goes, there was no movement westward or eastward. Fighting went on continually in all directions from 100 separate centers, and if there are reliable traditions of an Eastern pagan kinglet commanding some mixed host, once reaching so far west as to raid the valley of Wiltshire Avon, and another raiding to the Dee, so there are historical records of a Western Christian kinglet reaching and raiding the eastern settlements right down to the North Sea at Bamborough. 3. Now to the third point. What had survived of the old order in either half of this anarchy? Of Roman government, of Roman order, of true Roman civilization, of that Palatium of which we spoke in a previous chapter, nothing had anywhere survived. The disappearance of the Roman taxing and judicial machinery is the mark of Britain's great wound. It differentiates the fate of Britain from that of Gaul. The west of Britain had lost this Roman tradition of government just as much as the East. The Pict and Scot footnote, the Scots, that is the Irish, were of course of a higher civilization than the other raiders of Britain during this dark time. The Catholic Church reached them early. They had letters and the rest long before Augustine came to Britain. And the North Sea pirates, since they could not read or write, or build or make a road, or do anything appreciably useful, interrupted civilized life and so starved it. The raids did more to break up the old Roman society than did internal decay. The Western chieftains who retained the Roman religion had thoroughly lost the Roman organization of society before the year 600. The Roman language, probably only really familiar in the towns, seemed to have gone. The Roman method of building had certainly gone. In the West, the learned could still write, but they must have done so most sparingly, if we are to judge by the absence of any remains. The Church in some truncated and starved forms survived, indeed, in the West. It was the religion to which an imperial fragment, cut off from all other Roman populations, might be expected to cling. Paganism seems to have died out in the West, but the mutilated Catholicism that had taken its place became provincial, ill-instructed, and out of touch with Europe. We may guess, though it is only guesswork, that its chief ailment came from the spiritual fervour, ill-disciplined but vivid, of Brittany and of Ireland. What had survived in the eastern part of Britain? On the coasts and up the estuaries of the navigable rivers? Perhaps in patches the original language. It is a question whether Germanic dialects had not been known in eastern Britain long before the departure of the Roman legions. But anyhow, if we suppose the main speech of the East to have been Celtic and Latin before the pirate raids, then that main speech had gone. So perhaps altogether, certainly for the most part, had religion. So certainly had the arts, reading and writing and the rest. Oversea commerce had certainly dwindled, but to what extent we cannot tell. It is not credible that it wholly disappeared, but on the other hand there is very little trace of connection with southern and eastern Britain in the sparse continental records of this time. Lastly, and perhaps most important, the old bishoprics had gone. When St. Gregory sent St. Augustine and his missionaries to refound the old sees of Britain, his original plan of that refounding had to be wholly changed. He evidently had some old imperial scheme before him, in which he conceived of London, the great city, as the metropolis, and the lesser towns as suffragan to its see. But facts were too strong for him. He had to restore the Church in the coasts that cut off Britain from Europe, and in doing so he had to deal with a ruin. Tradition was lost, and Britain is the only Roman province in which this very great break in the continuity of the bishoprics is to be discovered. One thing did not disappear, and that was the life of the towns. Of course, a Roman town in the 6th or 7th century was not what it had been in the 4th or 5th, but it is remarkable that in all this wearing away of the old Roman structure, its framework, which was and is municipal, remained. If we cast up the principal towns reappearing when the light of history returns to Britain with St. Augustine's missionaries, we find that all of them are Roman in origin. What is more important, we find that the proportion of surviving Roman towns, centuries later, when full records exist, is even larger than it is in other provinces of the empire which we know to have preserved the continuity of civilization. Exeter, perhaps Norwich, Chester, Manchester, Lancaster, Carlisle, York, Canterbury, Lincoln, Rochester, Newcastle, Colchester, Bath, Winchester, Chichester, Gloucester, Cirencester, Leicester, Old Salisbury, Great London itself, these pegs upon which the web of Roman civilization was stretched stood firm through the confused welter of wars between all these petty chieftains, North Sea pirate, Welsh and Cumbrian and Pennine Highlander, Irish and Scotch. There was a slow growth of suburbs and some substitution of new suburban sites for old city sites, as at Southampton, Portsmouth, Bristol, Huntington, etc. It is what you find all over Europe. But there was no real disturbance of this scheme of towns until the industrial revolution of modern times came to diminish the almost immemorial importance of the Roman cities and to supplant their economic functions by the huge aggregations of the potteries, the Midlands, South Lancashire, the coalfields and the modern ports. The student of this main problem in European history, the fate of Britain, must particularly note the phenomena here described. It is the capital point of proof that Roman Britain, though suffering grievously from Anglo, Saxon, Scotch and Irish raids, and though cut off for a time from civilization, did survive. Those who prefer to think of England as a colony of barbarians in which the European life was destroyed have to suppress many a truth to conceive many an absurdity in order to support their story. But no absurdity of theirs is worse than the fiction they put forward with regard to the story of the English towns. It was solemnly maintained by the Oxford School and its German masters that these great Roman towns, one after the other, were first utterly destroyed by the pirates of the North Sea, then left in ruins for generations, and then reoccupied through some sudden whim by the newcomers. It needs no historical learning to laugh at such a fancy, but historical learning makes it even more impossible than it is laughable. Certain rare towns, of course, decayed in the course of centuries. The same is true, for that matter, of Spain and Gaul and Italy. Some few here, as many as in Spain and Gaul and Italy, may have been actually destroyed in the act of war. There is tradition of something of the sort at Pevensey, the old port of Anderida in Sussex, and for some time a forgery lent the same distinction to Wroxeter under the Wrekin. A great number of towns again, as in every other province of the Empire, naturally diminished with the effect of time. Dorchester on the Thames, for instance, seems to have been quite a large place for centuries after the first troubles with the pirates, though today is only a village. But it did not decay as a result of war. Sundry small towns became smaller still. Some few sank to hamlets as generation after generation of change passed over them. But we find just the same thing in Picardy, in the Roussillon, in Lombardy, in Aquitaine. What did not happen in Britain was a subversion of the Roman municipal system. Again, the unwalled settlement outside the walled town often grew at the expense of the municipality within the walls. I have given Huntingdon as an example of this, and there is St. Albans and Cambridge, but these also have their parallels in every other province in the West. Even in distant Africa you find exactly the same thing. You find it in the northern suburb of Roman Paris itself. That suburb turns into the head of the medieval town. Yet Paris is perhaps the best example of Roman continuity in all Europe. The seaports naturally changed in character, and often in actual site, especially upon the flat and therefore changeable eastern shores, and that is exactly what you find in similar circumstances throughout the tidal waters of the continent. There is not the shadow or the trace of any widespread destruction of the Roman towns in Britain. On the contrary, there is as much or more than elsewhere in the Empire the obvious fact of their survival. The phenomena is the more remarkable when we consider first that the names of Roman towns given above do not pretend to be a complete list. One may add immediately from memory the southern Dorchester, Dover, Doncaster, etc. And secondly, that we have but a most imperfect list remaining of the towns in Roman Britain. A common method among those who belittle the continuity of our civilization is to deny a Roman origin to any town in which Roman remains do not happen to have been noted as yet by antiquarians. But even under that test we can be certain that Windsor, Lewes, Arundel, Dorking and 20 others were seats of Roman habitation, though the remaining records of the 1st or 4th centuries tell us nothing of them. But in 9 cases out of 10 the mere absence of catalogued Roman remains proves nothing. The soil of towns is shifted and reshifted continually, generation after generation. The antiquary is not stationed at every digging of a foundation, or sinking of a well, or laying of a drain, or paving of a street. His methods are of recent establishment. We have lost centuries of research, and even with all our modern interest in such matters, the antiquary is not informed once in 100 times of chance discoveries, unless perhaps they be of coins. When, moreover, we consider that for 1500 years this turning and returning of the soil has been going on within the municipalities, it is ridiculous to affirm that such a place as Oxford, for instance, a town of importance in the later Dark Ages, had no Roman root, simply because the modern antiquary is not yet possessed of any Roman remains recently discovered in it. There may have been no town here before the 5th century, but it is unlikely. One further point must be noticed before we leave this prime matter. Had there been any considerable destruction of the Roman towns in Britain, large and small, we should expect it where the pirate raids fell earliest and most fiercely. We should expect to find the towns near the east and the south coast to have disappeared. The historical truth is quite opposite. The garrison of Anderida, indeed, and of Anderida alone, Pevensey was, if we may trust a vague phrase written 400 years later, massacred in war. But Lincoln, York, Newcastle, Colchester, London, Dover, Canterbury, Rochester, Chichester, Portchester, Winchester, the very principal examples of survival, are all of them either right on the eastern and southern coast or within a day's striking distance of it. As to decay, the great garrison centre of the 2nd Legion in the heart of the country, which the pirate raiders never reached, has sunk to be little Caerleon upon Usk, just as surely as Dorchester on the Thames, far away from the eastern coast, has decayed from a town to a village, and just as surely as Richborough, an island right on the pirate coast itself, has similarly decayed. As with destruction, so with decay. There is no increasing proportion as we go from west eastward towards the pirate settlements. The end of section 23. Section 24. Europe and the Faith. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Europe and the Faith by Hilaire Belloc, Section 24, Chapter 5, continued. But the point need not be labored. The supposition that the Roman towns disappeared is no longer tenable, and the wonder is how so astonishing an assertion could have lived for even a generation. The Roman towns survived, and with them Britain, though maimed. 4. Now for the last question. What novel things had come into Britain with this breakdown of the central imperial authority in the 5th and 6th centuries? To answer that is, of course, to answer the chief question of all, and it is the most difficult of all to answer. I've said that, presumably, on the south and east the language was new. There were numerous Germanic troops permanently in Britain before the legions disappeared. There was a constant intercourse with Germanic auxiliaries. There were probably colonies, half military, half agricultural. Some have even thought that Belgic tribes, whether in Gaul or Britain, spoke Teutonic dialects. But it is safer to believe, from the combined evidence of the place names and of later traditions, that there was a real change in the common talk of most men within a march of the Eastern Sea or the estuaries of its rivers. This change in language, if it occurred, and we must presume it did, though it is not absolutely certain, for there may have been a large amount of mixed German speech among the people before the Roman soldiers departed. This change of language, I say, is the chief novel matter. The decay of religion means less, for when the pirate raids began, though the empire was already officially Christian at its heart, the Church had only just taken firm root in the outlying parts. The institutions which arose in Britain everywhere when the central power of Rome decayed, the meetings of armed men to decide public affairs, money, compensation for injuries, the organizing of society by hundreds, etc., were common to all Europe. Nothing but ignorance can regard them as imported into Britain, or into Ireland, or Brittany, for that matter. by the pirates of the North Sea. They are things native to all our European race when it lives simply. A little knowledge of Europe will teach us that there was nothing novel or peculiar in such customs. They appear universally among the Iberians as among the Celts, among the pure Germans beyond the Rhine, the mixed Franks and Batavians upon the delta of that river, and the lowlands of the Scheldt and the Meuse, even among the untouched Roman populations. Everywhere you get, as the Dark Ages approach and advance, the meetings of armed men in council, the chieftain assisted in his government by such meetings, the weaponed assent or dissent of the great men in conference, the division of the land and people into hundreds, the fine for murder, and all the rest of it. Any man who says, and most men of the last generation said it, that among the changes of the 200 years gap was the introduction of novel institutions peculiar to the Germans, is speaking in ignorance of the European unity and of that vast landscape of our civilization which every true historian should, however dimly, possess. The same things talked of in a mixture of German and Latin terms between the Poole Harbour and the Bass Rock were talked of in Celtic terms from the Start to Glasgow. The chroniclers wrote them down in Latin terms alone everywhere from the Sahara to the Grampians and from the Adriatic to the Atlantic. The very Basques, who were soon to begin the resistance of Christendom against the Mohammedan in Spain, spoke of them in Basque terms. But the actual things, the institutions, for which all these various Latins, Basque, German and Celtic words stood, the blood fine, the scale of money, reparation for injury, division of society into hundreds, the council advising the chief, etc., were much the same throughout the body of Europe. They will always reappear wherever men of our European race are thrown into small warring communities, avid of combat, jealous of independence, organized under a military aristocracy, and reverent of custom. Everywhere, and particularly in Britain, the imperial measurements survived. The measurements of land, the units of money and of length and weight were all Roman, and nowhere more than in Eastern Britain during the Dark Ages. Lastly, let the reader consider the curious point of language. No more striking simulacrum of racial unity can be discovered than a common language or set of languages. But it is a simulacrum, and a simulacrum only. It is neither a proof nor a product of true unity. Language passes from conqueror to conquered, from conquered to conqueror, almost indifferently. Convenience, accident, and many a mysterious force which the historian cannot analyze, propagates it or checks it. Gaul, thickly populated, organized by but few garrisons of Roman soldiers and one army corps of occupation, learns to talk Latin universally, almost within living memory of the Roman conquest. Yet two corners of Gaul, the one fertile and rich, the other barren, Amorica and the Basque Islands, never accept Latin. Africa, though thoroughly colonized from Italy and penetrated with Italian blood as Gaul never was, retains the Punic speech century after century to the very ends of the Roman rule, 700 years after the fall of Carthage, 400 after the end of the Roman Republic. Spain, conquered and occupied by the Mohammedan and settled in very great numbers by a highly civilized Oriental race, talks today a Latin only just touched by Arabic influence. Lombardy, Gallic in blood and with a strong infusion of repeated Germanic invasions, very much larger than ever Britain had, has lost all trace of Gallic accent, and even in language, save in one or two Alpine valleys, and of German speech retains nothing but a few rare and doubtful words. The plain of Hungary and the Carpathian Mountains are a tessellated pavement of language, quite dissimilar. Mongolian, Teutonic, Slav. The Balkan states have, not upon their westward nor European side, but at their extreme opposite limit, a population which continues the memory of the empire in its speech, and the vocabulary of the Romanians is not the Greek of Byzantium, which civilized them, but the Latin of Rome. The most implacable of Mohammedans, now under French rule in Algiers, speak and have spoken for centuries, not Arabic in any form, but Berber, and the same speech reappears beyond a wide belt of Arabic in the far desert to the south. The Irish, a people in permanent contrast to the English, yet talk in the main the English tongue. French Canadians, accepting political unity with Britain, retain their tongue and reject English. Look where we will, we discover, in regard to language, something as incalculable as the human will and as various as human instinct. The deliberate attempt to impose it has nearly always failed. Sometimes it survives as the result of a deliberate policy. Sometimes it is restored as a piece of national protest. Bohemian is an example. Sometimes it catches on, naturally, and runs for hundreds of miles, covering the most varied peoples and even the most varied civilizations with a common veil. Now, the Roman towns were not destroyed. The original population was certainly not destroyed, even in the few original settlements of Saxon and Angles in the sea and the river shores of the East. Such civilization as the little courts of the pirate chieftains maintained was degraded Roman, or it was nothing. But the so-called Anglo-Saxon language, the group of half-German (footnote: I say half-German, lest the reader should think by the use of the word German or Teutonic that the various dialects of this sort, including those of the North Sea pirates, were something original, uninfluenced by Rome. It must always be remembered that with their original words and roots was mixed an equal mass of superior words learned from the civilized men of the South in the course of the many centuries during which Germans had served the Romans as slaves and in arms and had met their merchants. Dialects which may have taken root before the withdrawal of the Roman legions in the east of Britain, and which at any rate were well rooted. There, 100 years after, stood ready for one of two fates. Either it would die out and be replaced by dialects half Celtic, half Latin vocabulary, or it would spread westward. That the Teutonic dialects of the eastern kinglets should spread westward might have seemed impossible. The unlettered barbarian does not teach the lettered civilized man. The pagan does not mold the Christian. It is the other way about. Yet in point of fact that happened. Why? Before we answer that question, let us consider another point. Side by side with the entry of civilization through the Roman missionary priests in Kent, there was going on a missionary effort in the north of the Ireland of Britain, which effort was Irish. It had various Celtic dialects for its common daily medium, though it was of course Roman in ritual at the altar. The Celtic missionaries, had they alone been in the field, would have made us all Celtic speaking today. But it was the direct mission from Rome that won, and this for the reason that it had behind it the full tide of Europe. Letters, order, law, building, schools re-entered England through Kent, not through Northumberland, where the Irish were preaching. Even so, the spread westward of a letterless and starved set of dialects from the little courts of the eastern coasts, from Canterbury and Bamborough and so forth, would have been impossible but for a tremendous accident. St. Augustine, after his landing, proposed to the native British bishops that they should help in the conversion of the little pagan kinglets and their courts on the eastern coast. They would not. They had been cut off from Europe for so long that they had become warped. They refused communion. The peaceful Roman mission, coming just at the moment when the Empire had recovered Italy and was fully restoring itself, was thrown back on the eastern courts. It used them. It backed their tongues, their arms, their tradition. The terms of Roman things were carefully translated by the priests into the Teutonic dialects of these courts. The advance of civilization under the missionaries, recapturing more and more of the province of Britain, proceeded westward from the courts of the eastern kinglets. The schools, the official world, all was now turned by the weight of the Church against a survival of the Celtic tongues and in favor of the eastern Teutonic ones. Once civilization had come back by way of the south and east, principally through the natural gate of Kent and through the Straits of Dover, which had been blocked so long, This tendency of the Eastern dialects to spread as the language of an organized clerical officialdom and of its courts of law was immediately strengthened. It soon and rapidly swamped all but the western hills. But of the colonization, of the advance of a race, there was none. What advanced was the Roman organization once more, and with it the dialects of the courts it favored. What we know then of Britain when it was re-civilized, we know through Latin terms or through the half-German dialects which ultimately and much later merge into what we call Anglo-Saxon. An historic king of Sussex bears a Celtic name, but we read of him in Latin, then in the Teutonic tongues, and his realm, however feeble, the proportion of oversea blood in it bears an oversea label for its court, the South Saxon. The mythical founder of Wessex bears a Celtic name, Cerdic, but we read of him, if not in Latin, then in Anglo-Saxon. Not a cantref, but 100 is the term of social organization in England when it is re-civilized. Not an eglwys, but a church. Footnote: this word church is a good example of what we mean by Teutonic dialect. It is straight from the Mediterranean. The native German word for a temple, if they had got so far as to have temples, for we know nothing of their religion, is lost, is the name of a building in which the new civilization hears Mass. The ruler, whatever his blood or the blood of his subjects, is a sinning, not a reg or a prins. His house and court are a hall. Footnote: and hall is again a Roman word adopted by the Germans, not a plaz. We get our whole picture of renovated Britain after the church is restored, colored by this half-German speech. But the Britain we see thus colored is not barbaric. It is a Christian Britain of mixed origin, of ancient municipalities cut off for a time by the pirate occupation of the South and East, but now reunited with the one civilization whose root is in Rome. The end of section 24. Section 25, Europe and the Faith. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Europe and the Faith by Hilaire Belloc, Section 25, Chapter 5, concluded. This clear historical conclusion sounds so novel today that I must emphasize and confirm it. Western Europe in the 6th, 7th, and 8th centuries was largely indifferent to our modern ideas of race. Of nationality they knew nothing. It was concerned with the maintenance of the Catholic Church, especially against the outer pagan. This filled the mind. This drove all the mastering energies of the time. The Church, that is, all the acts of life, but especially record and common culture, came back into Britain, which had been cut off. It reopened the gate. It was refused aid by the Christian whom it relieved. It decided for the courts of the South and the East, taught them organization, and carried their dialects with it through the island, which it gradually recovered for civilization. We are now in a position to sum up our conclusions upon the matter. Britain, connected with the rest of civilization by a narrow and precarious neck of sea travel over the Straits of Dover, had in the last centuries of Roman rule often furnished great armies to usurpers or imperial claimants, sometimes leaving the island almost bare of regular troops. But with each return of peace, these armies also had returned, and the rule of the central Roman government over Britain had been fairly continuous until the beginning of the 5th century. At that moment, in 410 AD, the bulk of the trained soldiers again left upon a foreign adventure, but the central rule of Rome was then breaking down. These regulars never returned, though many auxiliary troops may have remained. At this moment, when every province of the West was subject to disturbance and to the overrunning of barbarian bands, small but destructive, Britain particularly suffered. Scotch, Irish, and German barbarians looted her on all sides. These last, the Saxon pirates, brought in as auxiliaries in the Roman fashion, may already have been settled in places upon the eastern coast. Their various half-German dialects may have already been common upon those coasts. But at any rate, after the breakdown of the Roman order, detached communities under little local chiefs arose. The towns were not destroyed. Neither the slaves, nor for that matter the greater part of the free population, fell. But wealth declined rapidly in the chaos, as it did throughout Western Europe. And side by side with this ruin came the replacing of the Roman official language by a welter of Celtic and of half-German dialects in a mass of little courts. The new official Roman religion, certainly at the moment of the breakdown, the religion of a small minority, almost or wholly disappeared in the eastern pirate settlements. The Roman language similarly disappeared in the many small principalities of the western part of the island. They reverted to their original Celtic dialects. There was no boundary between the hodgepodge of little German-speaking territories on the east and the little Celtic territories on the west. There was no more than a vague common feeling of west against east or east against west. All fought indiscriminately among themselves. After a time which could be covered by 2 long lives, during which decline had been very rapid, and as noticeable in the west as in the east throughout the island, the full influence of civilization returned with the landing in 597 of St. Augustine and his missionaries sent by the Pope. But the little pirate courts of the east happened to have settled on coasts which occupied the gateway into the island. It was thus through them that civilization had been cut off, and it was through them that civilization came back, on this account. 1. The little kingdoms tended to coalesce under the united discipline of the Church. 2. The united British civilization so forming was able to advance gradually westward across the island. 3. Though the institutions of Europe were much the same wherever Roman civilization had existed and had declined, though the councils of magnates surrounding the kings, the assemblies of armed men, the division of land and the people into hundreds, and the rest of it were common to Europe, these things were given over a wider and wider area of Britain. Eastern, half-German names, because it was through the courts of the eastern kinglets that civilization had returned. The kinglets of the East, as civilization grew, were continually fed from the continent, strengthened with ideas, institutions, arts, and the discipline of the Church. Thus did they politically become more and more powerful, until the whole island, except the Cornish peninsula, Wales, and the northwestern mountains, was more or less administered by the courts which had had their roots in the eastern coasts and rivers, and which spoke dialects cognate to those beyond the North Sea, while the West, cut off from this Latin restoration, decayed in political power and saw its Celtic dialects shrink in area. By the time that this old Roman province of Britain rearises as an ordered Christian land in the 8th century, its records are kept not only in Latin, but in the court Anglo-Saxon dialects, by far the most important being that of Winchester. Many place names and the general speech of its inhabitants have followed suit, and this, a superficial but a very vivid change, is the chief outward change in the slow transformation that has been going on in Britain for 300 years, 450 to 500 to 750 to 800. Britain is reconquered for civilization, and that easily. It is again an established part of the European unity, with the same sacraments, the same morals, and all those same conceptions of human life as bound Europe together even more firmly than the old central government of Rome had bound it. And within this unity of civilized Christendom, England was to remain for 800 years. The end of section 25. The end of chapter 5. Section 26. Europe and the Faith. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Europe and the Faith by Hilaire Belloc, Section 26, Chapter 6, The Dark Ages. So far we have traced the fortunes of the Roman Empire, that is, of European civilization and of the Catholic Church with which that civilization was identified, from the origins both of the Church and of the Empire to the turning point of the 5th century. We have seen the character of that turning point. There was a gradual decline in the power of the central monarchy, an increasing use of auxiliary barbarian troops in the army, upon which Roman society was founded, until at last, in the years from 400 to 500 AD, authority, though Roman in every detail of its form, gradually ceased to be exercised from Rome or Constantinople, but fell imperceptibly into the hands of a number of local governments. We have seen that the administration of these local governments usually devolved on the chief officers of the auxiliary barbarian troops, who were also, as a rule, their chieftains by some kind of inheritance. We have seen that there was no considerable infiltration of barbarian blood, no invasions in our modern sense of the term, or rather no successful ones, no blotting out of civilization, still less any introduction of new institutions or ideas drawn from barbarism. The coast regions of eastern Britain, the strongest example of all, for there the change was most severe, were reconquered for civilization and for the faith by the efforts of St. Augustine. Africa was recaptured for the direct rule of the empire, so was Italy and the south of Spain. At the end of the 7th century, that which was in the future to be called Christendom, and which is nothing more than the Roman Empire continuing, though transformed, is again reunited. What followed was a whole series of generations in which the forms of civilization were set and crystallized in a few very simple, traditional, and easily appreciated types. The whole standard of Europe was lowered to the level of its fundamentals, as it were. The primary arts upon which we depend for our food and drink and raiment and shelter survived intact. The secondary arts reposing upon these failed and disappeared almost in proportion to their distance from fundamental necessities of our race. History became no more than a simple chronicle. Letters in the finer sense almost ceased. 400 years more were to pass before Europe was to reawaken from this sort of sleep into which her spirit had retreated, and the passage from full civilization of Rome through this period of simple and sometimes barbarous things is properly called the Dark Ages. It is of great importance for anyone who would comprehend the general story of Europe to grasp the nature of those half-hidden centuries. They may be compared to a lake into which the activities of the old world flowed and stirred and then were still, and from which in good time the activities of the Middle Ages, properly so called, were again to flow. Again, one may compare the Dark Ages to the leaf soil of a forest. They are formed by the disintegration of antique florescence. They are the bed from which new florescence shall spring. It is a curious phenomenon to consider this hibernation or sleep, this rest of the stuff of Europe. It leads one to consider the flux and reflux of civilization as something much more comparable to a pulse than to a growth. It makes us remember that rhythm which is observed in all forms of energy. It makes us doubt that mere progress from simplicity to complexity which used to be affirmed as the main law of history. The contemplation of the Dark Ages affords a powerful criticism of that superficial theory of social evolution which is among the intellectual plagues of our own generation. Much more is the story of Europe like the waking and sleeping of a mature man than like any indefinite increase in the aptitudes and powers of a growing body. Though the prime characteristic of the Dark Ages is one of recollection, and though they are chiefly marked by this note of Europe sinking back into herself, very much more must be known of them before we have the truth, even in its most general form. I will put in the form of a category or list the chief points which we must bear in mind. In the first place, the Dark Ages were a period of intense military action. Christendom was besieged from all around. It was held like a stronghold, and in those centuries of struggle its institutions were molded by military necessities, so that Christendom has ever since had about it the quality of a soldier. There was one unending series of attacks, pagan and Mohammedan, from the north and from the east and from the south, attacks not comparable to the older raids of external hordes eager only to enjoy civilization within the empire, small in number and yet ready to accept the faith and customs of Europe. The barbarian incursions of the 5th and 6th centuries at the end of the united Roman Empire had been of this lesser kind. The mighty struggles of the 8th, 9th and especially the 10th centuries of the Dark Ages were a very different matter. Had the military institutions of Europe failed in that struggle, our civilization would have been wiped out, and indeed at one or two critical points, as in the middle of the 8th against the Mohammedan, and at the end of the 9th century against the northern pirates, all human judgment would have decided that Europe was doomed. In point of fact, as we shall see in a moment, Europe was just barely saved. It was saved by the sword and by the intense Christian ideal which nerved the sword arm, but it was only just barely saved. The first assault came from Islam. A new, intense and vividly anti-Christian thing arose in a moment, as it were, out of nothing, out of the hot sands to the east, and spread like a fire. It consumed all the Levant. It arrived at the doors of the West. This was no mere rush of barbarism. The Mohammedan world was as cultured as our own in its first expansion. It maintained a higher and increasing culture while ours declined, and its conquest where it conquered us was the conquest of something materially superior for the moment over the remaining arts and traditions of Christian Europe. Just at the moment when Britain was finally won back to Europe, and when the unity of the West seemed to be recovered, though its life had fallen to so much lower a plane, we lost North Africa. It was swept from end to end in one tidal rush by that new force which aimed fiercely at our destruction. Immediately afterward the first Mohammedan force crossed the Straits of Gibraltar, and in a few months after its landing the whole of the Spanish peninsula, that strong rock, as it had seemed, of ancient Roman culture, the hard Iberian land, crumbled. Politically at least, and right up to the Pyrenees, Asia had it in its grip. In the mountain valleys alone, and especially in the tangle of highlands which occupies the northwestern corner of the Spanish square, individual communities of soldiers held out. From these the gradual reconquest of Spain by Christendom was to proceed, but for the moment they were crowded and penned upon the Asturian hills like men fighting against a wall. Even Gaul was threatened. A Mohammedan host poured up into its very centre, far beyond Poitiers, halfway to Tours. Luckily it was defeated, but Moslem garrisons continued to hold out in the southern districts, in the northern fringes of the Pyrenees, and along the shoreline of the Narbonnese and Provence. Southern Italy was raided and partly occupied. The islands of the Mediterranean fell. Against this sudden, successful spring which had lopped off half of the West, the Dark Ages, and especially the French of the Dark Ages, spent a great part of their military energy. The knights of northern Spain and the chiefs of the unconquered valleys recruited their forces perpetually from Gaul beyond the Pyrenees and the northern valley of the Ebro. The high plains of Castile and Leon were the training grounds of the European valor for 300 years. The Basques were the unyielding basis of all the advance. This Mohammedan swoop was the first and most disastrously successful of the three great assaults. Next came the Scandinavian pirates. Their descent was a purely barbaric thing, not numerous, but, since pirates can destroy much with small numbers, for centuries unexhausted. They harried all the rivers and coasts of Britain, of Gaul and of the Netherlands. They appeared in the southern seas, and their efforts seemed indefatigable. Britain especially, where the raiders bore the local name of Danes, suffered from a ceaseless pillage, and these new enemies had no attraction to the Roman land save loot. They merely destroyed. They refused our religion. Had they succeeded, they would not have mingled with us, but would have ended us. Both in northern Gaul and in Britain, their chieftains acquired something of a foothold, but only after the perilous moment in which their armies were checked. They were tamed and constrained to accept the society they had attacked. This critical moment, when Europe seemed doomed, was the last generation of the 9th century. France had been harried up to the gates of Paris. Britain was so raided that its last independent king, Alfred, was in hiding. Both in Britain and Gaul, Christendom triumphed, and in the same generation. Paris stood a successful siege, and the family which defended it was destined to become the royal family of all France at the inception of the Middle Ages. Alfred of Wessex, in the same decade, recovered South England. In both provinces of Christendom the situation was saved. The chiefs of the pirates were baptized, and though northern barbarism remained a material menace for another 100 years, there was no further danger of our destruction. Finally, less noticed by history, but quite as grievous and needing a defense as gallant, was the pagan advance over the northern German plain and up the valley of the Danube. All the frontier of Christendom upon this line from Augsburg to the Lech, to the course of the Elbe and the North Sea, was but a line of fortresses and continual battlefields. It was but recently organized land. Until the generations before the year 800 there was no civilization beyond the Rhine, save the upper Danube, partially reclaimed, and a very scanty single extension up the valley of the lower Main. But Charlemagne, with vast Gallic armies, broke into the barbaric Germanies right up to the Elbe. He compelled them by arms to accept religion, letters, and arts. He extended Europe to these new boundaries, and organized them as a sort of rampart in the East, a thing the Roman Empire had not done. The Church was the cement of this new belt of defense, the imperfect population of which were evangelized from Ireland and Britain. It was an experiment, this creation of the Germanies by Western culture, this spiritual colonization of a march beyond the limits of the Empire. It did not completely succeed, as the Reformation proves, but it had at least the strength, in the century after Charlemagne, its founder, to save the Eastern attack upon Christendom. The end of section 26. Section 27. Europe and the Faith. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Europe and the Faith by Hilaire Belloc. Section 27, Chapter 6, continued. The attack was not racial. It was pagan, Slav, mixed with much that was left of pagan German, even Mongol. Its character was the advance of the savage against the civilized man, and it remained a peril 2 generations longer than the peril which Gaul and Britain had staved off from the north. This, then, is the first characteristic to be remembered of the Dark Ages: the violence of the physical struggle and the intense physical effort by which Europe was saved. The second characteristic of the Dark Ages proceeds from this first military one. It may be called feudalism. Briefly, it was this: the passing of the actual government from the hands of the old Roman provincial centers of administration into the hands of each small local society and its lord. On such a basis there was a reconstruction of society from below. These local lords associating themselves under greater men, and these again holding together in great national groups under a national overlord. In the violence of the struggle through which Christendom passed, town and village, valley and castle had often to defend itself alone. The great Roman landed estates, with their masses of dependents and slaves under a lord or owner, had never disappeared. The descendants of these Roman, Gallic, British owners formed the fighting class of the Dark Ages, and in this new function of theirs, perpetually lifted up to be the sole depositories of authority in some small imperiled countryside, they grew to be nearly independent units. For the purposes of cohesion, that family which possessed most estates in a district tended to become the leader of it. Whole provinces were thus formed and grouped, and the vaguer sentiments of a larger unity expressed themselves by the choice of some one family, one of the most powerful in every county, who would be the overlord of all the other lords, great and small. Side by side with this growth of local independence and of voluntary local groupings went the transformation of the old imperial nominated offices to hereditary and personal things. A count, for instance, was originally a comes, or companion, of the emperor. The word dates from long before the breakup of the central authority of Rome. A count later was a great official, a local governor and a judge, the viceroy of a large district, a French county, and English shire. His office was revocable like other official appointments. He was appointed for a season, first at the emperor's, later at the local king's discretion, to a particular local government. In the Dark Ages the count becomes hereditary. He thinks of his government as a possession which his son should rightly have after him. He bases his right to his government upon the possession of great estates within the area of that government. In a word, he comes to think of himself not as an official at all, but as a feudal overlord. And all society, and the remaining shadow of central authority itself, agrees with him. The second note, then, of the Dark Ages is the gradual transition of Christian society from a number of slave-owning, rich landed proprietors, taxed and administered by a regular government, to a society of fighting nobles and their descendants organized upon a basis of independence and in a hierarchy of lord and overlord, and supported no longer by slaves in the villages, but by half-free serfs or villeins. Later, an elaborate theory was constructed in order to rationalize this living and real thing. It was pretended, by a legal fiction, that the central king owned nearly all the land, that the great overlords held their land of him, the lesser lords holding theirs hereditarily of the overlords, and so forth. This idea of holding instead of owning, though it gave an easy machinery for confiscation in time of rebellion, was legal theory only, and so far as men's views of property went, a mere form. The reality was what I have described. The third characteristic of the Dark Ages was the curious fixity of morals, of traditions, of the forms of religion, and of all that makes up social life. We may presume that all civilization originally sprang from a soil in which the custom was equally permanent. We know that in the great civilizations of the East an enduring fixity of form is normal. But in the general history of Europe it has been otherwise. There has been a perpetual flux in the outward form of things, in architecture, in dress, and in the statement of philosophy, as well, though not in its fundamentals. In this mobile surface of European history, the Dark Ages form a sort of island of changelessness. There is an absence of any great heresies in the West, and, save in one or two names, an absence of speculation. It was as though men had no time for any other activity but the ceaseless business of arms and the defense of the West. Consider the life of Charlemagne, who is the central figure of those centuries. It is spent almost entirely in the saddle. One season finds him upon the Elbe, the next upon the Pyrenees. One Easter he celebrates in northern Gaul, another in Rome. The whole story is one of perpetual marching, and of blows parrying here, thrusting there, upon all the boundaries of isolated and besieged Christendom. He will attend to learning, but the ideal of learning is repetitive and conservative. Its passion is to hold what was, not to create or expand. An anxious and sometimes desperate determination to preserve the memory of a great but half forgotten past is the business of his court, which dissolves just before the worst of the pagan assault, as it is the business of Alfred, who arises a century later, just after the worst assault has been finally repelled. Religion during these centuries settled and consolidated, as it were. An enemy would say that it petrified, a friend that it was enormously strengthened by pressure. But whatever the metaphor chosen, the truth indicated will be this: that the Catholic faith became, between the years 600 and 1000, utterly one with Europe. The last vestiges of the antique and pagan civilization of the Mediterranean were absorbed. A habit of certitude and of fixity, even in the details of thought, was formed in the European mind. It is to be noted in this connection that geographically the center of things had somewhat shifted. With the loss of Spain and of northern Africa, the Mohammedan raiding of southern Italy and the islands, the Mediterranean was no longer a vehicle of Western civilization, but the frontier of it. Rome itself might now be regarded as a frontier town. The eruption of the barbarians from the east along the Danube had singularly cut off the Latin West from Constantinople and from all the high culture of its empire. Therefore the center of that which resisted in the West, the geographical nucleus of the island of Christendom, which was besieged all round, was France, and in particular northern France. Northern Italy, the Germanies, the Pyrenees, and the upper valley of the Ebro were essentially the marches of Gaul. Gaul was to preserve all that could be preserved of the material side of Europe, and also of the European spirit. And therefore the New World, when it arose, with its Gothic architecture, its parliaments, its universities, and in general its spring of the Middle Ages, was to be a Gallic thing. The fourth characteristic of the Dark Ages was a material one, and was that which would strike our eyes most immediately if we could transfer ourselves in time and enjoy a physical impression of that world. This characteristic was derived from what I have just been saying. It was this material counterpart of the moral immobility or steadfastness of the time. It was this: that the external forms of things stood quite unchanged. The semicircular arch, the short, stout pillar, occasionally but rarely the dome, these were everywhere the mark of architecture. There was no change nor any attempt at change. The arts were saved but not increased, and the whole of the work that men did with their hands stood fast in mere tradition. No new town arises. If one is mentioned, Oxford for instance, for the first time in the Dark Ages, whether in Britain or in Gaul, one may fairly presume a Roman origin for it, even though there be no actual mention of it handed down from Roman times. No new roads were laid. The old Roman military system of highways was kept up and repaired, though kept up and repaired with a declining vigor. The wheel of European life had settled to one slow rate of turning. Not only were all these forms enduring, they were also few and simple. One type of public building and of church, one type of writing, everywhere recognizable, one type of agriculture with very few products to differentiate it, alone remained. The end of section 27. Section 28, Europe and the Faith. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Europe and the Faith by Hilaire Belloc. Section 28, Chapter 6, concluded. The fifth characteristic of the Dark Ages is one apparently, but only apparently, contradictory of that immobile and fundamental character which I have just been describing. It is this: the Dark Ages were the point during which there very gradually germinated and came into outward existence things which still remain among us and help to differentiate our Christendom from the past of classical antiquity. This is true of certain material things: the spur, the double bridle, the stirrup, the book in leaves, distinct from the old roll, and very much else. It is true of the road system of Europe, wherever that road system has departed from the old Roman scheme. It was in the Dark Ages, with the gradual breakdown of expensive causeways over marshes, with the gradual decline of certain centres, with bridges left unrepaired, culverts choked and making a morass against the dam of the roads, that you got the deflection of the great ways. In almost every broad river valley in England, where an old Roman road crosses the stream and its low-lying banks, you may see something which the Dark Ages left to us in our road system. You may see the modern road leaving the old Roman line and picking its way across the wetlands from one drier point to another, and rejoining the Roman line beyond. It is a thing you will see in almost any one of our Strettons, Stanfords, Stamfords, Staffords, etc., which everywhere mark the crossing of a Roman road over a water course. But much more than in material things, the Dark Ages set a mould wherein the European mind grew. For instance, it was they that gave us two forms of legend. The one, something older than history, older than the Roman order, something of a Western reappearing with the release of the mind from the rigid accuracy of a high civilization. The other, that legend which preserves historical truth under a guise of fantasy. Of the first, the British story of Tristan is one example out of 1,000. Of the second, the legend of Constantine, which gradually and unconsciously developed into the famous donation. The Dark Ages gave us that wealth of story, colouring and enlivening all our European life, and what is more, largely preserving historic truth. For nothing is more valuable to true history than legend. They also gave us our order in speech. Great hosts of words unknown to antiquity sprang up naturally among the people when the force of the classical centre failed. Some of them were words of the languages before the Roman armies came. Casque, for instance, the old Iberian word. Some of them were the camp talk of the soldiers. Spade, for instance, and épée, the same piece of English slang, the broad one, which has come to mean in French a sword, in English that with which we dig the earth. Masses of technical words in the old Roman laws turned into popular usage through that appetite the poor have for long official phrases. For instance, our English words wild, weald, wold, waste, gain, rider, road, ledge, say, and 1,000 others, all branch out from the lawyers' phrases of the later Roman Empire. In this closed crucible of the Dark Ages, crystallized also by a process which we cannot watch, or of which we have but glimpses, that rich mass of jewels, the local customs of Europe, and even the local dress which differentiates one place from another when the communication of a high material civilization breaks down. In all this the Dark Ages are a comfort to the modern man, for he sees by their example that the process of increasing complexity reaches its term, that the strain of development is at last relieved, that humanity sooner or later returns upon itself, that there is an end in repose, and that the repose is fruitful. The last characteristic of the Dark Ages is that which has most engrossed, puzzled, and warped the judgments of non-Catholic historians when they have attempted a conspectus of European development. It was the segregation, the homogeneity, and the dominance of clerical organization. The hierarchy of the Church, its unity and sense of discipline, was the chief civil institution and the chief binding social force of the times. Side by side with it went the establishment of the monastic institution, which everywhere took on a separate life of its own, preserved what could be preserved of arts and letters, drained the marshes and cleared the forests, and formed the ideal economic unit for such a period, almost the only economic unit in which capital could then be accumulated and preserved. The great order of St. Benedict formed the framework of living points upon which was stretched the moral life of Europe. The vast and increasing endowments of great and fixed religious houses formed the economic flywheel of those centuries. They were the granary and the storehouse. But for the monks, the fluctuations proceeding from raid and from decline would, in their violence, at some point or another, have snapped the chain of economic tradition, and we should all have fallen into barbarism. Meanwhile, the Catholic hierarchy as an institution, I have already called it by a violent metaphor a civil institution, at any rate as a political institution, remained absolute above the social disintegration of the time. All natural things were slowly growing up unchecked and disturbing the strict lines of the old centralized governmental order which men still remembered. In language, Europe was a medley of infinitely varying local dialects. Thousands upon thousands of local customs were coming to be separate laws in each separate village. Legend, as I have said, was obscuring fixed history. The tribal basis from which we spring was thrusting its instincts back into the strict and rational Latin fabric of the state. Status was everywhere replacing contract, and habit replacing a reason for things. Above this medley, the only absolute organization that could be was that of the Church. The papacy was the one center whose shifting could not even be imagined. The Latin tongue, in the late form in which the Church used it, was everywhere the same, and everywhere suited to rituals that differed but slightly from province to province when we contrast them with the millioned diversity of local habit and speech. Whenever a high civilization was to re-arise out of the soil of the Dark Ages, it was certain first to show a full organization of the Church under some pope of exceptional vigor, and next to show that pope or his successors in this tradition at issue with new civil powers. Whenever central government should rise again, and in whatever form, a conflict would begin between the new kings and the clerical organization which had so strengthened itself during the Dark Ages. Now Europe, as we know, did awake from its long sleep. The 11th century was the moment of its awakening. Three great forces, the personality of St. Gregory VII, the appearance, by happy accident, of slight cross-breeding, a touch of Scandinavian blood added to the French race, of the Norman race, finally the Crusades, drew out of the darkness the enormous vigor of the early Middle Ages. They were to produce an intense and active civilization of their own, a civilization which was undoubtedly the highest and the best our race has known, conformable to the instincts of the European, fulfilling his nature, giving him that happiness which is the end of men. As we also know, Europe, on this great experiment of the Middle Ages, after 400 years of high vitality, was rising to still greater heights when it suffered shipwreck. With that disaster, the disaster of the Reformation, I shall deal later in this series. In my next chapter I shall describe the inception of the Middle Ages and show what they were before our promise in them was ruined. The end of section 28. The end of chapter 6. Section 29. Europe and the Faith. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Europe and the Faith by Hilaire Belloc. Section 29, Chapter 7, The Middle Ages. I said in my last chapter that the Dark Ages might be compared to a long sleep of Europe, a sleep lasting from the fatigue of the old society in the 5th century to the spring and rising of the 11th and 12th. The metaphor is far too simple, of course, for that sleep was a sleep of war. In all those centuries Europe was desperately holding its own against the attack of all that desired to destroy it. Refined and ardent Islam from the south, letterless barbarian pagans from the east and north, At any rate, from that sleep or that besieging, Europe awoke or was relieved. I said that three great forces, humanly speaking, worked this miracle: the personality of St. Gregory VII, the brief appearance by a happy accident of the Norman state, and finally the Crusades. The Normans of history, the true French Normans we know, are stirring a generation after the year 1000. St. Gregory filled that same generation. He was a young man when the Norman effort began. He died full of an enormous achievement in 1085. As much as any one man could, he, the heir of Cluny, had remade Europe. Immediately after his death there was heard the march of the Crusades. From these three the vigor of a fresh, young, renewed Europe proceeds. Much might be added. The perpetual and successful chivalric charge against the Mohammedan in Spain illumined all that time and clarified it. Asia was pushed back from the Pyrenees, and through the passes of the Pyrenees perpetually cavalcaded the high adventures of Christendom. The Basques, a strange and very strong small people, were the pivot of that reconquest, but the valley of the torrent of the Aragon was its channel. The life of St. Gregory is contemporaneous with that of El Cid Campeador in the same year that St. Gregory died. Toledo, the sacred center of Spain, was at last forced from the Mohammedans and their Jewish allies, and firmly held. All southern Europe was alive with the sword. In that same moment romance appeared. The great songs, the greatest of them all, the Song of Roland, then was a ferment of the European mind, eager from its long repose, piercing into the undiscovered fields, that watching skepticism which flanks and follows the march of the faith, when the faith is most vigorous, and had also begun to speak. There was even some expansion beyond the boundaries eastward, so that something of the unfruitful Baltic plain was reclaimed. Letters awoke, and philosophy. Soon the greatest of all human exponents, St. Thomas Aquinas, was to appear. The plastic arts leapt up. Color and stone, humor fully returned, general travel, vision. In general, the moment was one of expectation and of advance. It was spring. For the purposes of these few pages, I must confine the attention of my reader to those three tangible sources of the new Europe, which, as I have said, were the Normans, St. Gregory VII, and the Crusades. Of the Norman race we may say that it resembled in history those mira, or new stars, which flare out upon the darkness of the night sky for some few hours, or weeks, or years, and then are lost or merged in the infinity of things. He is indeed unhistorical who would pretend William the Conqueror, the organizer and maker of what we now call England, Robert the Wizard, the conquerors of Sicily, or any of the great Norman names that light Europe in the 11th and 12th centuries, to be even partly Scandinavians. They were Gauls, short in stature, lucid in design, vigorous in stroke, positive in philosophy. They bore no outward relation to the soft and tall and sentimental North, from which some few of their remote ancestry had drawn ancestral names. But on the other hand, anyone who should pretend that all this amazing and ephemeral phenomenon, the Norman, was merely Gallo-Roman, would commit an error far less gross but still misleading. In speech, in manner, in accoutrement, in the very trick of riding the horse, in the cooking of food, in that most intimate part of man, his jests, the Norman was wholly and apparently a Gaul. In his body, hard, short, square, broad-shouldered, alert, the Norman was a Frenchman only. But no other part of Gaul then did what Normandy did, nor could any other French province show, as Normandy showed, immediate, organized and creative power during the few years that marvel lasted. That marvel is capable of explanation, and I will attempt to explain it. Those dull, blundering and murderous ravagings of the coasts of Christian Europe by the pirates of Scandinavia, few in number, futile in achievement, which we call in English history the Danish invasions, were called upon the opposite coast of the Channel the invasions of the Normanni, or the men of the North. They came from the Baltic and from Norway. They were part of the universal assault which the dark ages of Christendom had to sustain, part of a ceaseless pressure from without against civilization. And they were but a part of it. They were few, as pirates always must be. It was on the estuaries of a few continental rivers and in the British Isles that they counted most in the lives of Europeans. Now, among the estuaries of the great rivers was the estuary of the Seine. The Scandinavian pirates forced it again and again. At the end of the 9th century they had besieged Paris, which was then rapidly becoming the political centre of Gaul. So much was there left of the Roman tradition in that last stronghold of the Roman Empire, that the quieting of invading hordes by their settlement, by intermarriage, and with granting of land in a fixed Roman province, was a policy still obvious to those who still called themselves the emperors of the West. In the year 911, this antique method, consecrated by centuries of tradition, produced its last example, and the barbarian troublers from the sea were given a fixed limit of land wherein they might settle. The maritime province, Lugdunensis Secunda, footnote, the delimitation of this province dated from Diocletian. It was already 600 years old. Its later name of Normandy masked this essential fact, and it was and is a Roman division, as for that matter are probably our English counties, was handed over to them for settlement. That is, they might not attempt a partition of the land outside its boundaries. On the analogy of all similar experiments we can be fairly certain of what happened, though there is no contemporary record of such domestic details in the case of Normandy. The barbarians, few in number, coming into a fertile and thickly populated Roman province, only slightly affected its blood. But their leaders occupied waste land, planted themselves as heirs of existing childless lords, took to wife the heiresses of others, and feoffed groups of small men, took a share of the revenue, helped to answer for military levy and general government. Their chief was responsible to the crown. To the mass of the population the new arrangement would make no change. They were no longer slaves, but they were still serfs, secure of their small farms, but still bound to work for their lord. It mattered little to them whether that lord of theirs had married his daughter to a pirate, or had made a pirate his heir or his partner in the management of the estate. All the change the serf would notice from the settlement was that the harrying and the plundering of occasional barbarian raids had ceased. In the governing class of perhaps some 10 to 20,000 families, the difference would be very noticeable indeed. The pirate newcomers, though insignificant in number compared with the total population, were a very large fraction added to so small a body. The additional blood, though numerically a small proportion, permeated rapidly throughout the whole community. Scandinavian names and habits may have had at first some little effect upon the owner class with which the Scandinavians first mingled. It soon disappeared, but as had been the case centuries before in the earlier experiments of that sort, it was the barbarian chief and his hereditary descendants who took over the local government and held it, as the phrase went, of the universal government of Gaul. These Northmen, the new and striking addition to the province, the Gallo-Romans called, as we have seen, Normanny, the Roman province within the limits of which they were strictly settled, the second Lyonnese, came to be called Normannia. For a century the slight admixture of new blood worked in the general Gallo-Roman mass of the province, and numerically small though it was, influenced its character, or rather produced a new thing, just as in certain chemical combinations the small admixture of a new element transforms the whole. With the beginning of the 11th century, as everything was springing into new life, when the great saint who, from the chair of Peter, was to restore the Church, was already born, when the advance of the Pyreneans against Islam was beginning to strike its decisive conquering blows, there appeared a sudden phenomena, this new thing, French in speech and habit and disposition of body, yet just differentiated from the rest of Frenchmen, the Norman race. It possessed these characteristics: a great love of exact order, an alert military temper, and a passion for reality which made its buildings, even of ships, though it was not in the main seafaring, excellent, and of churches and of castles the most solid of its time. All the Normans' characteristics, once the race was formed, led them to advance. They conquered England and organized it. They conquered and organized Sicily and southern Italy. They made of Normandy itself the model state in a confused time. They surveyed land. They developed a regular tactic for mailed cavalry. Yet they endured but for 100 years, and after that brief coruscation they are wholly merged again in the mass of European things. You may take the first adventurous lords of the Cotentin, say in 1030, for the beginning of the Norman thing. You may take the court of young Henry II, with his southerners and his high culture, in say 1160, most certainly for the burial of it. During that little space of time the Norman had not only reintroduced exactitude in the government of men, he had also provided the sword of the new papacy, and he had furnished the framework of the crusading host. But before his adventure was done, the French language and the writ of Rome ran from the Grampians to the Euphrates. The end of section 29. Section 30. Europe and the Faith. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Europe and the Faith by Hilaire Belloc. Section 30, Chapter 7 concluded. Of the Papacy and the Crusades I now speak. St. Gregory VII, the second of the great recreative forces of that time, was of the Tuscan peasantry, Etrurian in type, therefore Italian in speech, by name Hildebrand. Whether an historian understands his career or no is the very test of whether that historian understands the nature of Europe. For St. Gregory VII imposed nothing upon Europe. He made nothing new. What he did was to stiffen the ideal with reality. He provoked a resurrection of the flesh. He made corporate the centralized Church and the West. For instance, it was the ideal, the doctrine, the tradition, the major custom by far, that the clergy should be celibate. He enforced celibacy as universal discipline. The awful majesty of the papacy had been present in all men's minds as a vast political conception for centuries too long to recall. St. Gregory organized that monarchy and gave it proper instruments of rule. The unity of the Church had been the constant image without which Christendom could not be. St. Gregory VII at every point made that unity tangible and visible. The Protestant historians, who for the most part see in the man a sporadic phenomena, by such a misconception betray the source of their animam and prove their intellectual nourishment to be unfed from the fountain of European life. St. Gregory VII was not an inventor but a renovator. He worked not upon but in his material, and his material was the nature of Europe, our nature. Of the awful obstacles such workers must encounter, all history speaks. They are at conflict not only with evil, but with inertia, and with local interest, with blurred vision, and with restricted landscapes. Always they think themselves defeated, as did St. Gregory when he died. Always they prove themselves before posterity to have done much more than any other mold of man. Napoleon also was of this kind. When St. Gregory was dead, the Europe which he left was the monument of that triumph whose completion he had doubted, and the fear of whose failure had put upon his dying lips the phrase, "I have loved justice and hated iniquity. Therefore I die in exile." Immediately after his death came the stupendous Gallic effort of the Crusades. The Crusades were the second of the main armoured eruptions of the Gauls. The first centuries before had been the Gallic invasion of Italy and Greece and the Mediterranean shores in the old pagan time. The third, centuries later, was to be the wave of the Revolution and of Napoleon. The preface to the Crusades appeared in those endless and already successful wars of Christendom against Asia upon the high plateaus of Spain. These had taught the enthusiasm and the method by which Asia, for so long at high tide flooding a beleaguered Europe, might be slowly repelled, and from these had proceeded the military science and the aptitude for strain which made possible the advance of 2,000 miles upon the Holy Land. The consequences of this last and third factor in the reawakening of Europe were so many that I can give but a list of them here. The West, still primitive, discovered through the Crusades the intensive culture, the accumulated wealth, the fixed civilized traditions of the Greek Empire and of the town of Constantinople. It discovered also in a vivid new experience the East, the mere covering of so much land, the mere seeing of so many sights by 1,000,000 men, expanded and broke the walls of the mind of the Dark Ages. The Mediterranean came to be covered with Christian ships and took its place again with fertile rapidity as the great highway of exchange. Europe awoke. All architecture is transformed, and that quite new thing, the Gothic, arises. The conception of representative assembly, monastic in origin, fruitfully transferred to civilian soil, appears in the institutions of Christendom. The vernacular languages appear, and with them the beginnings of our literature. The Tuscan, the Castilian, the Languedoc, the Northern French, somewhat later the English. Even the primitive tongues that had always kept their vitality from beyond recorded time, the Celtic and the German. [Footnote: I mean in neither of the groups of tongues as we first find them recorded, for by that time each, especially the German, was full of southern words borrowed from the Empire, but the original stocks which survive side by side with this new vocabulary. For instance, our first knowledge of Teutonic dialect is of the 8th century. The so-called Early Gothic is a fraud. But even then quite half the words or more are truly German, apparently unaffected by the imperial laws and speech. Begin to take on new creative powers and to produce a new literature. That fundamental institution of Europe, the university, arises, first in Italy, immediately after in Paris, which last becomes the type and center of the scheme. The central civil governments begin to correspond to their natural limits. The English monarchy is fixed first, the French kingdom is coalescing, the Spanish regions will soon combine, the Middle Ages are born. The flower of that capital experiment in the history of our race was the 13th century. Edward I of England, St. Louis of France, Pope Innocent III were the types of its governing manhood. Everywhere Europe was renewed. There were new white walls around the cities, new white Gothic churches in the towns, new castles on the hills, law codified, the classics rediscovered, the questions of philosophy sprung to activity, and producing in their first vigor, as it were, the summit of expository power in St. Thomas, surely the strongest, the most virile intellect which our European blood has given to the world. Two notes mark the time for anyone who is acquainted with its buildings, its letters, and its wars: a note of youth and a note of content. Europe was imagined to be at last achieved, and that ineradicable dream of permanent and satisfactory society seemed to have taken on flesh and to have come to live forever among Christian men. No such permanence and no such good is permitted to humanity, and the great experiment, as I have called it, was destined to fail. While it flourished, all that is specially characteristic of our European descent and nature stood, visibly present, in the daily life and in the large as in the small institutions of Europe. Our property in land and instruments was well divided among many or all. We produced the peasant, we maintained the independent craftsman, we founded cooperative industry. In arms, that military type arose which lives upon the virtues proper to arms and detests the vices arms may breed. Above all, an intense and living appetite for truth, a perception of reality invigorated these generations. They saw what was before them. They called things by their names. Never was political or social formula less divorced from fact. Never was the mass of our civilization better welded. And in spite of all this, the thing did not endure. By the middle of the 14th century, the decaying of the flower was tragically apparent. New elements of cruelty tolerated, of mere intrigue successful, of emptiness in philosophical phrase, and of sophistry in philosophical argument, marked the turn of the tide. Not an institution of the 13th, but the 14th, debased it. The papacy, professional and a prisoner, the parliaments tending to oligarchy, the popular ideals dimmed in the minds of the rulers, the new and vigorous and democratic monastic orders, already touched with mere wealth and beginning also to change. But these last can always, and do always, restore themselves. Upon all this came the enormous incident of the Black Death. Here half the people, there a third, there again a quarter, died from that additional blow. The great experiment of the Middle Ages could not recover. Men clung to their ideal for yet another 150 years. The vital forces it had developed still carried Europe from one material perfection to another. The art of government, the suggestion of letters, the technique of sculpture and of painting, here raised by a better vision, there degraded by a worse one, everywhere developed and grew manifold. But the supreme achievement of the 13th century was seen in the later 14th to be ephemeral, and in the 15th it was apparent that the attempt to found a simple and satisfied Europe had failed. The full causes of that failure cannot be analyzed. One may say that science and history were too slight, that the material side of life was insufficient, that the full knowledge of the past which is necessary to permanence was lacking, or one may say that the ideal was too high for men. I, for my part, incline to believe that wills other than those of mortals were in combat for the soul of Europe, as they are in combat daily for the souls of individual men, and that in this spiritual battle, fought over our heads, perpetually some accident of the struggle turned it against us for a time. If that suggestion be fantastic, which no doubt it is, at any rate none other is complete. With the end of the 15th century there was to come a supreme test and temptation, the fall of Constantinople and the release of Greek, the rediscovery of the classic past, the press, the new great voyages, India to the east, America to the west, had, in the one lifetime of a man, footnote, the lifetime of one very great and famous man did cover it, Ferdinand, King of Aragon, the mighty Spaniard, the father of the noblest English queens, was born the year before Constantinople fell. He died the year before Luther found himself swept to the head of a chaotic wave. Between 1453 and 1515, suddenly brought Europe into a new, a magic and a dangerous land. To the provinces of Europe, shaken by an intellectual tempest of physical discovery, disturbed by an abrupt and undigested enlargement in the material world, in physical science, and in the knowledge of antiquity, was to be offered a fruit of which each might taste if it would, but the taste of which would lead, if it were acquired, to evils no citizen of Europe then dreamt of, to things which even the criminal intrigues and the cruel tyrants of the 15th century would have shuddered to contemplate, and to a disaster which very nearly overset our ship of history, and very nearly lost us for ever its cargo of letters, of philosophy, of the arts, and of all our other powers. That disaster is commonly called the Reformation. I do not pretend to analyze its material causes, for I doubt if any of its causes were wholly material. I rather take the shape of the event and show how the ancient and civilized boundaries of Europe stood firm, though shaken, under the tempest, how that tempest might have ravaged no more than those outlying parts newly incorporated, never sufficiently penetrated perhaps with the faith and the proper habits of ordered men, the outer Germanies and Scandinavia. The disaster would have been upon a scale not too considerable, and Europe might quickly have righted herself after the gust should be past, had not one exception of capital amount marked the intensest crisis of the storm. That exception to the resistance offered by the rest of ancient Europe was the defection of Britain. Conversely with this loss of an ancient province of the Empire, one nation and one alone of those which the Roman Empire had not bred, stood the strain and preserved the continuity of Christian tradition. That nation was Ireland. The end of section 30, the end of chapter 7. Section 31, Europe and the Faith. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Europe and the Faith by Hilaire Belloc. Section 31, Chapter 8. What was the Reformation? This is perhaps the greatest of all historical questions, after the original question, what was the Church in the Empire of Rome? A true answer to this original question gives the nature of that capital revolution by which Europe came to unity and to maturity, and attained to a full consciousness of itself. An answer to the other question, what was the Reformation, begins to explain our modern ill-ease. A true answer to the question, what was the Reformation, is of such vast importance because it is only when we grasp what the Reformation was that we understand its consequences. Then only do we know how the united body of European civilization has been cut asunder, and by what a wound. The abomination of industrialism, the loss of land and capital by the people in great districts of Europe, the failure of modern discovery to serve the end of man, the series of larger and still larger wars following in a rapidly rising scale of severity and destruction, till the dead are now counted in tens of millions, the increasing chaos and misfortune of society, all these attach one to the other, each falls into its place, and 100 smaller phenomena as well, when we appreciate as today we can the nature and the magnitude of that fundamental catastrophe. It is possible that the perilous business is now drawing to its end, and that, though those now living will not live to see it, Christendom may enter into a convalescence, may at last forget the fever and be restored. With that I am not here concerned. It is my business only to explain that storm which struck Europe 400 years ago and within a century brought Christendom to shipwreck. The true causes are hidden, for they were spiritual. In proportion as an historical matter is of import to humankind, in that proportion does it spring not from apparent, let alone material causes, but from some hidden revolution in the human spirit. To pretend an examination of the secret springs whence the human mind is fed is futile. The greater the affair, the more directly does it proceed from unseen sources, which the theologian may catalogue, the poet see in vision, the philosopher explain, but with which positive external history cannot deal, and which the mere historian cannot handle. It is the function of history to present the outward thing as a witness might have seen it, and to show the reader as much as the spectator could have seen, illuminated indeed by a knowledge of the past, and a judgment drawn from known succeeding events. The historian answers the question, what was this or that? To the question, why was it, if it be the spiritual order, as are all major things, the reader must attempt his own reply, based upon other aptitudes than those of historic science. It is the neglect of this canon which makes barren so much work upon the past. Read Gibbon's attempt to account for why the Catholic Church arose in the Roman Empire, and mark his empty failure. Footnote: it is true that Gibbon was ill-equipped for his task because he lacked historical imagination. He could not grasp the spirit of a past age. He could not enter into any mood save that of his master Voltaire. But it is not only true of Gibbon that he fails to explain the Great Revolution of A.D. 29 to 304. No one attempting that explanation has succeeded. It was not of this world. Mark also saw how all examination of the causes of the French Revolution are coloured by something small and degraded, quite out of proportion to that stupendous crusade which transformed the modern world. The truth is that the historian can only detail those causes, largely material, all evident and positive, which lie within his province, and such causes are quite insufficient to explain the full result. Were I here writing why the Reformation came, my reply would not be historic, but mystic. I should say that it came from outside mankind, but that would be to affirm without the hope of proof, and only in the confidence that all attempts at positive proof were contemptible. Luckily, I am not concerned in so profound an issue, but only in the presentation of the thing as it was. Upon this I now set out. With the close of the Middle Ages, two phenomena appeared side by side in the society of Europe. The first was an aging and growing fatigue of the simple medieval scheme. The second was a very rapid accretion of technical power. As to the first, I have suggested, it is no more than a suggestion, that the medieval scheme of society, though much the best fitted to our race and much the best expression which it has yet found, though especially productive of happiness, which here and hereafter is the end of man, was not properly provided with instruments of survival. Its science was too imperfect, its institutions too local, though its philosophy was the widest ever framed and the most satisfying to the human intelligence. Whatever be the reason, that society did rapidly grow old. Its every institution grew formal or debased. The guilds, from true cooperative partnerships for a proper distribution of the means of production, and for the prevention of a proletariat with its vile cancer of capitalism, tended to become privileged bodies. Even the heart of Christian Europe, the village, showed faint signs that it might become an oligarchy of privileged farmers with some land and less men at their orders. The monastic orders were tainted in patches up and down Europe with worldliness, with an abandonment of their strict rule, and occasionally with vice. Civil government grew befogged with tradition and with complex rules. All manner of theatrical and false trappings began to deform society, notably the exaggeration of heraldry and a riot of symbolism of which very soon no one could make head or tail. The temporal and visible organization of the Church did not escape in such a welter. The lethargy, avarice and routine from which that organization suffered has been both grossly exaggerated and set out of perspective. A wild picture of it has been drawn by its enemies. But in a degree the temporal organization of the Church had decayed at the close of the Middle Ages. It was partly too much a taking of things for granted, a conviction that nothing could really upset the unity of Europe, partly the huge concentration of wealth in clerical hands, which proceeded from the new economic activity all over Europe, coupled with the absolute power of the clergy in certain centres and the universal economic function of Rome, partly a popular loss of faith. All these between them helped to do the business. At any rate, the evil was there. All institutions, says Machiavelli, must return to their origins, or they fail. There appeared throughout Europe in the last century of united Europe, breaking out here and there, sporadic attempts to revivify the common life, especially upon its spiritual side, by a return to the primitive communal enthusiasms in which religion necessarily has its historical origins. This was in no way remarkable. Neither was it remarkable that each sporadic and spontaneous outburst should have its own taint or vice or false colour. What was remarkable, and what made the period unique in the whole history of Christendom, save for the Arian flood, was the incapacity of the external organization of the Church at the moment to capture the spiritual discontent and to satisfy the spiritual hunger of which these errors were the manifestation. In a slower time the external organization of the Church would have absorbed and regulated the new things, good and evil. It would have rendered the heresies ridiculous in turn. It would have canalized the exaltations. It would have humanized the discoveries. But things were moving at a rate more and more rapid. The whole society of Western Christendom raced from experience to experience. It was flooded with the newly founded manuscripts of antiquity, with the new discoveries of unknown continents, with new commerce, printing, and an effect perhaps rather than a cause, the complete rebirth of painting, architecture, sculpture, and all the artistic expression of Europe. In point of fact, this doubt and seething and attempted return to early religious enthusiasm were not digested and were not captured. The spiritual hunger of the time was not fed. Its extravagance was not exposed to the solvent of laughter or to the flame of a sufficient indignation. They were therefore neither withered nor eradicated, for the spirit had grown old. The great movement of the spirit in Europe was repressed, haphazard, and quite as much haphazard, encouraged, but there seemed no one corporate force present throughout Christendom which would persuade, encourage, and command. Even the papacy, the core of our unity, was shaken by long division and intrigue. Let it be clearly understood that in the particular form of special heresies the business was local, peculiar, and contemptible. Wycliffe, for instance, was no more the morning star of the Reformation than Catherine of Braganza's Tangier dowry, let us say, was the morning star of the modern English Empire. Wycliffe was but one of a great number of men who were theorizing up and down Europe upon the nature of society and morals, each with his special metaphysic of the sacrament, each with his system. Such men have always abounded. They abound today. Some of Wycliffe's extravagances resemble what many Protestants happen later to have held. Others, such as his theory that you could not own land unless you were in a state of grace, were of the opposite extreme to Protestantism. And so it is with the whole lot. And there were hundreds of them. There was no common theory, no common feeling in the various reactions against a corrupted ecclesiastical authority which marked the end of the Middle Ages. There was nothing the least like what we call Protestantism today. Indeed, that spirit and mental colour does not appear until a couple of generations after the opening of the Reformation itself. What there was a widespread discontent and exasperated friction against the existing rigid and yet deeply decayed temporal organization of religious affairs, and in their uneasy fretting against that unworthy rule, the various centres of irritation put up now one startling theory which they knew would annoy the official church, now another, perhaps the exact opposite of the last. Now they denied something as old as Europe, such as the right to property. Now a new piece of usage or discipline, such as communion in one kind. Now a partial regional rule, such as celibacy. Some went stark mad. Others, at the contrary extreme, did no more than expose false relics. A general social ill-ease was the parent of all these sporadic heresies. Many had elaborate systems, but none of these systems was a true creed, that is, motive. No one of the outbursts had any philosophic driving power behind it at all, and each were no more than violent and blind reactions against a clerical authority which gave scandal and set up an intolerable strain. Shall I give an example? One of the most popular forms which the protest took was what I have just mentioned, a demand for communion in both kinds and for the restoration of what was in many places ancient custom, the drinking from the cup after the priest. Could anything better prove the truth that mere irritation against external organization of the Church was the power at work? Could any point have less to do with the fundamentals of the faith? Of course, as an implication of false doctrine, as that the priesthood is not in order, or that the presence of our Lord is not in both species, it had its importance. But in itself, how trivial a kick! Why should anyone desire the cup, save to mark dissension from established custom? The end of section 31. Section 32. Europe and the Faith. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Europe and the Faith by Hilaire Belloc, Section 32, Chapter 8, concluded. Here is another example. Prominent among the later expressions of discontent, you have the Adamites. Footnote: the rise of these oddities is nearly contemporary with Wycliffe, and is, like his career, about 100 years previous to the Reformation proper. The sects are of various longevity. Some, like the Calvinists, have, while dwindling rapidly in numbers, kept their full doctrines for now 400 years. Others, like the Joanna Southcotites, hardly last a lifetime. Others, like the Modernists, a decade or less. Others, like the Mormons, nearly a century. Their close is not yet. I myself met a man in Colorado in 1891 whose friends thought him the Messiah. Unlike the Wycliffites, certain members of the Adamites, until lately, survived in Austria, who, among other tenets, rejected clothes upon the more solemn occasions of their ritual and went naked, raving maniacs. The whole business was a rough and tumble of protest against the breakdown of a social system whose breakdown seemed the more terrible because it had been such a haven, because it was, in essence, founded upon the most intimate appetites of European men. The heretics were angry because they had lost their home. This very general picture omits Huss and the national movement for which he stood. It omits the papal schism, the Council of Constance, all the great facts of the 15th century on its religious side. I am concerned only with the presentation of the general character of the time, and that character was what I have described: an irrepressible, largely justified discontent breaking out, a sort of chronic rash upon the skin of Christian Europe, which rash the body of Christendom could neither absorb nor cure. Now at this point, and before we leave the 15th century, there is another historical feature which it is of the utmost importance to seize if we are to understand what followed, for it was a feature common to all European thought until a time long after the final establishment of permanent cleavage in Europe. It is a feature which nearly all historians neglect, and yet one manifest upon the reading of any contemporary expression. That feature is this: no one in the Reformation dreamt a divided Christendom to be possible. This flood of heretical movement was ecumenical. It was not peculiar to one race or climate or culture or nation. The numberless uneasy innovators thought, even the wildest of them, in terms of Europe as a whole. They desired to effect the universal church and to change it en bloc. They had no local ambition. They stood for no particular blood or temperament. They sprang up everywhere, bred by the universal ill-ease of a society still universal. You were as likely to get an enthusiast declaring himself to be the Messiah in Seville as an enthusiast denying the real presence in Aberdeen. That fatal habit of reading into the past what we know of its future has in this matter most deplorably marred history and men, whether Protestant or Catholic, who are now accustomed to Protestantism, read Protestantism and the absurd idea of a local religion, a religion true in one place and untrue in another, into a time where the least instructed clown would have laughed in your face at such nonsense. The whole thing, the evil coupled with a quite ineffectual resistance to the evil, was a thing common to all Europe. It is the nature of any organic movement to progress or to recede, but this movement was destined to advance with devastating rapidity, and on that account of what I have called the second factor of the Reformation, the very rapid accretion in technical power which marked the close of the Middle Ages. Printing, navigation, all mensuration, the handling of metals and every material, all these took a sudden leap forward with the Renaissance, the revival of arts, that vast stirring of the later Middle Ages which promised to give us a restored antiquity, Christianized, which was burnt in the flame of a vile fanaticism and has left us nothing but ashes and incommiscible salvage. Physical knowledge, the expansion of physical experience and technical skill, moving in the century before the Reformation at such a rate that a contemporary spiritual phenomena, if it advanced at all, was bound to advance very rapidly, and this spiritual eruption in Europe came to a head just at the moment when the contemporary expansion of travel, of economic activity, and of the revival of learning had also emerged in their full force. It was in the first 20 years of the 16th century that the coalescing of the various forces of spiritual discontent and revolt began to be apparent. Before 1530, the general storm was to burst, and the Reformation proper to be started on its way. But as a preliminary to that matter, the reader should first understand how another and quite disconnected social development had prepared the way for the triumph of the Reformers. This development was the advent of absolute government in civil affairs. Here and there in the long history of Europe there crops up an isolated accident, very striking, very effective, of short duration. We have already seen that the Norman race was one of these. Tyranny in civil government, which accompanied the Reformation, was another. A claim to absolute monarchy is one of the commonest and most enduring of historical things. Countless centuries of the old empires of the East were passed under such a claim. The Roman Empire was based upon it. The old Russian state was made by it. French society luxuriated in it for one magnificent century, from the accession of Louis XIV till Fontenoy. It is the easiest and, when it works, the most prompt of all instruments. But the sense of an absolute civil government at the moment of the Reformation was something very different. It was a demand, an appetite, proceeding from the whole community, a worship of civil authority. It was deification of the state and of law. It was the adoration of the executive. This governs me, therefore I will worship it and do all it tells me. Such is the formula for the strange passion which has now and then seized great bodies of human beings intoxicated by splendor and by the vivifying effects of command. Like all manias, for it is a mania, this exaggerated passion is hardly comprehended once it is past. Like all manias, while it is present, it overrides every other emotion. Europe, in the time of which I speak, suffered such a mania. The free cities manifested that disease quite as much as the great monarchical states. In Rome itself, the temporal power of the papal sovereign was then magnificent beyond all past parallel. In Geneva, Calvin was a god. In Spain, Charles and Philip governed two worlds without question. In England the Tudor dynasty was worshipped blindly. Men might and did rebel against a particular government, but it was only to set up something equally absolute in its place. Not the form, but the fact of government was adored. I will not waste the reader's time in any discussion upon the causes of that astonishing political fever. It must suffice to say that for the moment it hypnotized the whole world. It would have been incomprehensible to the Middle Ages. It was incomprehensible to the 19th century. It wholly occupied the 16th. If we understand it, we largely understand what made the success of the Reformation possible. Well then, the increasing discontent of the masses against the decaying forms of the Middle Ages, and the increasing irritation against the temporal government and the organization of the Church, came to a head just at that moment when civil government was worshipped as an awful and almost divine thing. Into such an atmosphere was launched the last, the strongest of the overt protests against the old social scheme, and in particular against the existing power of the papacy, especially upon its economic side. The name most prominently associated with the crisis is that of Martin Luther, an Augustinian monk, German by birth and speech, and one of those exuberant, sensual, rather inconsequential characters which so easily attract hearty friendships, and which can never pretend to organization or command, though certainly to creative power. What he precisely meant or would do, no man could tell, least of all himself. He was out for protest, and he floated on the crest of the general wave of change. That he ever intended, nay, that he could ever have imagined a disruption of the European unity is impossible. Luther, a voice, no leader, was but one of many. Had he never lived, the great bursting wave would have crashed onward much the same. One scholar after another, and these of every blood and from every part of Europe, joined in the upheaval. The opposition of the old monastic training to the newly revived classics, of the ascetic to the new pride of life, of the logician to the mystic, all these in a confused whirl swept men of every type into the disruption. One thing only united them. They were all inflamed with a vital necessity for change. Great names, which in the ultimate challenge refused to destroy and helped to preserve, the greatest is that of Erasmus, great names which even appear in the role of that of the Catholic martyrs, the blessed Thomas More is the greatest of these, must here be counted with the names of men like the narrow Calvin on the one hand, the large Rabelais upon the other. Not one ardent mind in the first half of the 16th century but was swept into the stream. Now all this would and must have been quieted in the process of time. The mass of Christendom would have settled back into unity, the populace would have felt instinctively the risk they ran of spoliation by the rich and powerful if the popular institutions of Christendom broke down. The masses would have all swung round to solidifying society after an upheaval. It is their function. We should have attained repose, and Europe, united again, would have gone forward as she did after the rocking of 400 years before, but for that other factor of which I have spoken, the passion which this eager creative moment felt for the absolute in civil government, that craving for the something godlike which makes men worship a flag, a throne, or a national hymn. This it was which caught up and in the persons of particular men used the highest of the tide. Certain princes in the Germanies, who had, all of the groups of Europe, least grasped the meaning of authority, befriended here one heresiarch and there another. The very fact that the Pope of Rome stood for one of these absolute governments put other absolute governments against him. The wind of the business rose. It became a quarrel of sovereigns, and the sovereigns decided, and powerful usurping nobles or leaders decided the future of the herd. Two further characters appeared side by side in the earthquake that was breaking up Europe. The first was this: The tendency to fall away from European unity seemed more and more marked in those outer places which lay beyond the original limits of the old Roman Empire, and notably in the northern Netherlands and in northern Germany, where men easily submitted to the control of wealthy merchants and of hereditary landlords. The second was this: a profound distrust of the new movement, a reaction against it, a feeling that moral anarchy was too profitable to the rich and the cupidinous, began at first in a dull, later in an angry way, to stir the masses of the populace throughout all Christendom. The stronger the old Latin sense of human equality was, the more the populace felt this, the more they instinctively conceived of the Reformation as something that would rob them of some ill-understood but profound spiritual guarantee against slavery, exploitation and oppression. There began a sort of popular grumbling against the Reformers, who were now already schismatic. Their rich patrons fell under the same suspicion. By the time the movement had reached a head, and by the time the central power of the Church had been openly defied by the German princes, this protest took, as in France and England and the valley of the Rhone, the ancient seats of culture, a noise like the undertone of the sea before bad weather. In the outer Germanies it was not a defense of Christendom at all, but a brutish cry for more food. But everywhere the populace stirred. A general observer, cognizant of what was to come, would have been certain at that moment that the populace would rise. When it rose intelligently, the movement against the Church and the civilization would come to nothing. The revolt elsewhere in half-barbaric Europe would come to no more than the lopping off of outer and insignificant things. The Baltic plain, sundry units of the outer Germanies and Scandinavia, probably Hungary, possibly Bohemia, certain mountain valleys in Switzerland and Savoy and France and the Pyrenees, which had suffered from lack of instruction and could easily be recovered. These would be affected. The outer parts, which had never been within the pale of the Roman Empire, might go, but the soul and intelligence of Europe would be kept sound, its general body would reunite, and Christendom would once more reappear whole and triumphant. It would have reconquered these outer parts at its leisure, and Poland was a sure bastion. We should, within a century, have been ourselves once more Christian men. So it would have been but for one master tragedy which changed the whole scheme. Of the four great remaining units of Western civilization, Iberia, Italy, Britain, Gaul, one, at this critical moment, broke down by a tragic accident and lost continuity. It was hardly intended. It was a consequence of error much more than an act of will, but it had full effect. The breakdown of Britain and her failure to resist disruption was the chief event of all. It made the Reformation permanent. It confirmed a final division in Europe. By a curious accident, one province, extraneous to the Empire, Ireland, heroically preserved what the other extraneous provinces, the Germanies and Scandinavia, were to lose. In spite of the loss of Britain, and cut off by that loss from a direct succor, Ireland preserved the tradition of civilization. It must be my next business to describe the way in which Britain failed in the struggle, and at the hands of the King and a little group of avaricious men, such as the Howards among the gentry and the Cecils among the adventurers, changed for the worse the history of Europe. The end of section 32. The end of chapter 8. Section 33. Europe and the Faith. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Europe and the Faith by Hilaire Belloc. Section 33, Chapter 9, The Defection of Britain. One thing stands out in the fate of modern Europe. the profound cleavage due to the Reformation. One thing made that wound, it was almost mortal, so deep and lasting: the failure of one ancient province of civilization, and one only, to keep the faith. This province whereof I write, Britain. The capital event, the critical moment in the great struggle of the faith against the Reformation, was the defection of Britain. It is a point which the modern historian, who is still normally anti-Catholic, does not and cannot make. Yet the defection of Britain from the faith of Europe 300 years ago is certainly the most important historical event in the last 1,000 years, between the saving of Europe from the barbarians and these our own times. It is perhaps the most important historical event since the triumph of the Catholic Church under Constantine. Let me recapitulate the factors of the problem as they would be seen by an impartial observer from some great distance in time or in space or in mental attitude. Let me put them as they would appear to one quite indifferent to and remote from the antagonists. To such an observer, the history of Europe would be that of the great Roman Empire passing through the transformation I have described. Its mind first more and more restless, then more and more tending to certain conclusion, and that conclusion the Catholic Church. To summarize what has gone before, the Catholic Church becomes by the 5th century the soul, the vital principle, the continuity of Europe. It next suffers grievously from the accident, largely geographical, of the Eastern Schism, which is of its nature perpetually subject to assault from within, because it deals with matters not open to positive proof; from without, because all those, whether aliens or guests or parasites, who are not of our civilization, are naturally its enemies. The Roman Empire of the West, in which the purity and the unity of this soul were preserved from generation to generation, declined in its body during the Dark Ages, say up to and rather beyond the year 1000. It became coarsened and less in its material powers. It lost its central organization, the imperial court, which was replaced first by provincial military leaders or kings, then later by a mass of local lordships jumbled into more or less national groups. In building, in writing, in cooking, in clothing, in drawing, in sculpture, the Roman Empire of the West, which is ourselves, forgot all but the fundamentals of its arts, but it expanded so far as its area is concerned. A whole belt of barbaric Germany received the Roman influence, baptism and the Mass. With the Creed there came to these outer parts, reading and writing, building in brick and stone, all the material essentials of our civilization. And what is characteristic of that culture? The power of thinking more clearly. It is centuries before this slow digestion of the barbarian reached longitude 10 degrees east and the Scandinavian peninsula. But 1,000 years after our Lord it has reached even these, and there remains between the unbroken tradition of our civilization in the West and the schismatic but Christian civilization of the Greek Church nothing but a belt of paganism from the corner of the Baltic southward, which belt is lessened year after year by the armed efforts and the rational dominance of Latin culture. Our Christian and Roman culture proceeds continuously eastward, mastering the uncouth. After this general picture of a civilization dominating and mastering in its material decline a vastly greater area than it had known in the height of its material excellence, this sort of expansion in the dark, the impartial observer whom we have supposed would remark a sort of dawn. That dawn came with the 11th century, 1000 to 1100. The Norman race, the sudden invigoration of the papacy, the new victories in Spain, at last the First Crusade, mark a turn in the tide of material decline, and that tide works very rapidly towards a new and intense civilization which we called that of the Middle Ages, that high renewal which gives Europe a second and most marvellous life, which is a late reflowering of Rome, but of Rome revivified with the virtue and the humour of the faith. The second thing that the observer would note in so general a picture would be the peculiar exception formed within it by the group of large islands lying to the north and west of the continent. Of these the larger, Britain, had been a true Roman province, but very early in the process, in the middle and the end of the 5th century, it had, on the first assault of the barbarians, been cut off for more than the lifetime of a man. Its gate had been held by the barbarian. Then it was re-Christianized almost as thoroughly as though even its eastern part had never lost the authority of civilization. The mission of St. Augustine recaptured Britain, but Britain is remarkable in the history of civilization for the fact that alone of civilized lands it needed to be recaptured at all. The western island of the two, the smaller island, Ireland, presented another exception. It was not compelled to the Christian culture, as were the German barbarians of the continent, by arms. No Charlemagne with his Gallic armies forced it tardily to accept baptism. It was not savage like the Germanies. It was therefore under no necessity to go to school. It was not a morass of shifting tribes. It was a nation, but in a most exceptional fashion. Though already possessed, and perhaps because so possessed, of a high pagan culture of its own, it accepted within the lifetime of a man, and by spiritual influences alone, the whole spirit of the creed. The civilization of the Roman West was accepted by Ireland, not as a command or as an influence, but as a discovery. Now let this peculiar fate of the two islands to the north and west of the continent remain in the observer's mind, and he will note, when the shock of what is called the Reformation comes, new phenomena attaching to those islands, cognate to their early history. Those phenomena are the thesis which I have to present in the pages that follow. What we call the Reformation was essentially the reaction of the barbaric, the ill-tutored, and the isolated places external to the old and deep-rooted Roman civilization against the influences of that civilization. The Reformation was not racial, even if there were such a physical thing as a Teutonic race, and there is nothing of the kind. The Reformation shows no coincidence with that race. The Reformation is simply the turning back of that tide of Roman culture which for 500 years had steadily set forward and had progressively dominated the insufficient by the sufficient, the slower by the quicker, the confused by the clear-headed. It was a sort of protest by the conquered against a moral and intellectual superiority which offended them. The Slavs of Bohemia joined in that sincere protest of the lately and insufficiently civilized quite as strongly as, and even earlier than, the vague peoples of the sandy heaths along the Baltic. The Scandinavian, physically quite different from these tribes of the Baltic plain, comes into the game. Wretched villages in the Mark of Brandenburg, as Slavonic in type as the villages of Bohemia, revolt as naturally against exalted and difficult mystery as do the isolated villages of the Swedish valleys or the isolated rustics of the Cevennes or the Alps. The revolt is confused, instinctive, and therefore enjoying the sincere motive which accompanies such risings, but deprived of unity and of organizing power. There has never been a fixed Protestant creed. The common factor has been and is reaction against the traditions of Europe. Now the point to seize is this. Inimical as such a revolt was to the souls, or to speak upon the mere historical plane, to civilization, bad as it was that the tide of culture should have begun to ebb from the far regions which it had once so beneficently flooded, the Reformation, that is, the reaction against the unity, the discipline, and the clear thought of Europe, would never have counted largely in human affairs had it been confined to the external fringe of the civilized world. That fringe would probably have been reconquered. The inherent force attaching to reality and to the stronger mind should have led to its recovery. The northern Germanies were, as a fact, reconquered when Richelieu stepped in and saved them from their southern superiors. But perhaps it would not have been reconquered. Perhaps it would have lapsed quite soon into its original paganism. At any rate, European culture would have continued undivided and strong without these outer regions. Unfortunately, a far worse thing happened. Europe was rent and has remained divided. The disaster was accomplished through forces I will now describe. The end of section 33. Section 34, Europe and the Faith. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Europe and the Faith by Hilaire Belloc, Section 34, Chapter 9, continued. Though the revolt was external to the foundations of Europe, to the ancient provinces of the Empire, yet an external consequence of that revolt arose within the ancient provinces. It may be briefly told. The wealthy took advantage, within the heart of civilization itself, of this external revolt against order. For it is always to the advantage of the wealthy to deny general conceptions of right and wrong, to question a popular philosophy, and to weaken the drastic and immediate power of the human will, organized throughout the whole community. It is always in the nature of a great wealth to be insanely tempted, though it should know from active experience how little wealth can give, to push on to more and more domination over the bodies of men, and it can do so best by attacking fixed social restraints. The landed squires, then, and the great merchants, powerfully supported by the Jewish financial communities in the principal towns, felt that within the Reformation their opportunity had come. The largest fortune holders, the nobles, the merchants of the ports and local capitals, even in Gaul, that nucleus and stronghold of ordered human life, licked their lips. Everywhere in northern Italy, in southern Germany upon the Rhine, wherever wealth had congested in a few hands, the chance of breaking with the old morals was the most powerful appeal to the wealthy, and therefore throughout Europe, even in its most ancient seats of civilization, the outer barbarian had allies. These rich men, whose avarice betrayed Europe from within, had no excuse. Theirs was not any dumb, instinctive revolt like that of the outer Germanies, the outer Slavs, nor the neglected mountain valleys, against order and against clear thought, with all the hard consequences that clear thought brings. They were in no way subject to enthusiasm for the vaguer emotions roused by the Gospel, or for the more turgid excitements derivable from Scripture and an uncorrected orgy of prophecy. They were on the make. The rich in Montpellier and Nîmes, a knot of them in Rome itself, many in Milan, in Lyons, in Paris, enlisted intellectual aid for the revolt, flattered the atheism of the Renaissance, supported the strong, inflamed critics of clerical misliving, and even winked solemnly at the lunatic inspirations of obscure men and women filled with visions. They did all these things as though their objective was religious change, but their true object was money. One group, and one alone of the European nations, was too recently filled with combat against vile non-Christian things to accept any parley with this anti-Christian turmoil. That unit was the Iberian Peninsula. It is worthy of remark, especially on the part of those who realize that the sword fits the hand of the Church, and that Catholicism is never more alive than when it is in arms. I say it is worthy of remark by these that Spain and Portugal, through the very greatness of an experience still recent when the Reformation broke, lost the chance of combat. There came indeed from Spain, but from the Basque nation there, that weapon of steel, the Society of Jesus, which St. Ignatius formed, and which, surgical and military, saved the faith, and therefore Europe. But the Iberian Peninsula, rejecting as one whole, and with contempt, and with abhorrency, and rejecting rightly, any consideration of revolt, even among its rich men, thereby lost its opportunity for combat. It did not enjoy the religious wars which revivified France, and it may be urged that Spain would be the stronger today had it fallen to her task, as it did to the general populace of Gaul, to come to hand grips with the Reformation at home, to test it, to know it, to dominate it, to bend the muscles upon it, and to re-emerge triumphant from the struggle. I say then that there was present in the field against the Catholic Church a powerful ally for the Reformers, and that ally was the body of immoral rich who hoped to profit by a general break in the popular organization of society. The atheism and the wealth, the luxury and the sensuality, the scholarship and aloofness of the Renaissance answered, over the heads of the Catholic populace, the call of barbarism. The iconoclasts of greed joined hands with the iconoclasts of blindness and rage, and with the iconoclasts of academic pride. Nevertheless, even with such allies, barbarianism would have failed. The Reformation would today be but an historical episode without fruit. Europe would still be Christendom, had not there been added the decisive factor of all, which was the separation of Britain. Now, how did Britain go, and why was the loss of Britain of such capital importance? The loss of Britain was of such capital importance because Britain alone of those who departed was Roman, and therefore capable of endurance and increase. And why did Britain fail that great ordeal? It is a question harder to answer. The province of Britain was not a very great one in area or in numbers when the Reformation broke out. It was indeed very wealthy for its size, as were the Netherlands, but its mere wealth does not account for the fundamental importance of the loss of Britain to the faith in the 16th century. The real point was that one and only one of the old Roman provinces, with their tradition of civilization, letters, persuasive power, multiple soul, and one and only one, went over to the barbaric enemy and gave that enemy its aid. That one was Britain, and the consequences of its defection was the perpetuation and extension of an increasingly evil division within the structure of the West. To say that Britain lost hold of tradition in the 16th century because Britain is Teutonic is to talk nonsense. It is to explain a real problem by inventing unreal words. Britain is not Teutonic, nor does the word Teutonic itself mean anything definite. To say that Britain revolted because the seeds of revolt were stronger in her than in any ancient province of Europe is to know nothing of history. The seeds of revolt were in her then, as they were in every other community, as they must be in every individual who may find any form of discipline a burden which he is tempted in a moment of disorder to lay down. But to pretend that England and the lowlands of Scotland, to pretend that the province of Britain in our general civilization was more ready for the change than the infected portions of southern Gaul or the humming towns of northern Italy or the intense life of Hainault or Brabant, is to show great ignorance of the European past. Well then, how did Britain break away? I beg the reader to pay especial attention to the next page or so. I believe it to be of capital value in explaining the general history of Europe, and I know it to be hardly ever told, if told at all, told only in fragments. England went because of three things. First, her squires had already become too powerful. In other words, the economic power of a small class of wealthy men had grown on account of peculiar insular conditions, greater than was healthy for the community. Secondly, England was, more than any other part of Western Europe, save the Batavian March, I mean Belgium, that frontier of Roman influence upon the lower Rhine, which so happily held out for the faith and just preserved it. A series of markets and of ports, a place of very active cosmopolitan influence in which new opportunities for the corrupt, new messages of the enthusiastic, were frequent. In the third place, that curious phenomena on which I dwelt in the last chapter, the superstitious attachment of citizens to the civil power, to awe of and devotion to the monarch, was exaggerated in England as nowhere else. Now put these three things together, especially the first and third, for the second was both of minor importance and more superficial, and you will appreciate why England fell. One small, too wealthy class, tainted with the atheism that always creeps into wealth long and securely enjoyed, was beginning to possess too much of English land. It would take far too long to describe here what the process had been. It is true that the absolute monopoly of the soil, the gripping and the strangling of the populace by landlords, is a purely Protestant development. Nothing of that kind had happened or would have been conceived of as possible in pre-Reformation England. But still something like a quarter of the land, or a little less, had already, before the Reformation, got into the full possession of one small class, which had also begun to encroach upon the judiciary in some measure to supplant the populace in local law-making, and quite appreciably to supplant the king in central law-making. The end of section 34. Section 35, Europe and the Faith. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Europe and the Faith by Hilaire Belloc. Section 35, Chapter 9, continued. Let me not be misunderstood. The England of the 15th century, the England of the generation just before the Reformation, was not an England of squires. It was not an England of landlords. It was still an England of Englishmen. The towns were quite free. To this day, old boroughs nearly always show a great number of freeholds. The process by which the later English aristocracy, now a plutocracy, had grown up was but in germ before the Reformation. Nor had that germ sprouted. But for the Reformation it would not have matured. Sooner or later a popular revolt, had the faith revived, would have killed the growing usurpation of the wealthy. But the germ was there, and the Reformation coming just as it did, both was helped by the rich and helped them. The slow acquisition of considerable power over the courts of law and over the soil of the country by an oligarchy, imperfect though that acquisition was as yet, already presented just after 1500 a predisposing condition to the disease. It may be urged that if the English people had fought the growing power of the squires more vigorously, the squires would not have mastered them as they did during and on account of the religious revolution. Possibly, and the enemies of the English people are quick to suggest that some native sluggishness permitted the gradual weighing down of the social balance in favor of the rich. But no one who can even pretend to know medieval England will say that the English consciously desired or willingly permitted such a state of affairs to grow up. Successful foreign wars, dynastic trouble, a recent and vigorous awakening of national consciousness, which consciousness had centered in the wealthier classes, all these combined to let the evil in without warning. And on the eve of the Reformation, a rich, avaricious class was already empowered to act in Britain, ready to grasp, as all the avaricious classes were throughout the Western world, at the opportunity to revolt against the faith which has ever suspected, constrained, and reformed the tyranny of wealth. Now add to this strange, but at that time very real, worship of government as a fetish. This spirit did not really strengthen the government, far from it. A superstition never strengthens its object, nor even makes of the supposed power of that object a reality. But though it did not give real power to the long intention of the prince, it gave to the momentary word of the prince a fantastic power. In such a combination of circumstances, nascent oligarchy, but the prince worshipped, you get holding the position of prince, Henry VIII, a thorough Tudor, that is, a man weak almost to the point of irresponsibility where his passions were concerned, violent from that fundamental weakness which, in the absence of opposition, ruins things as effectively as any strength. No executive power in Europe was less in sympathy with the revolt against civilization than was the Tudor family. Upon the contrary, Henry VII, his son, and his two granddaughters, if anything, exceeded in their passion for the old order of the Western world. But at the least sign of resistance, Mary, who burnt Elizabeth, who intrigued Henry, their father, who pillaged Henry, their grandfather, who robbed and saved, were one. To these characters slight resistance was a spur; with strong manifold opposition they were quite powerless to deal. Their minds did not grip, or their minds though acute were not large, but their passions shot, and one may compare them, when their passions of pride, of lust, of jealousy, of doting, of avarice, or of facile power were aroused, to vehement children. Never was there a ruling family less statesmanlike, never one less full of stuff and of creative power. Henry, urged by an imperious young woman who had gained control of him, desired a divorce from his wife Catherine of Aragon, grown old for him. The papal court temporized with him and opposed him. He was incapable of negotiation, and still more incapable of foresight. His energy, which was of an Arabian sort, blasted through the void, because a void was there. None would then withstand the prince. Of course, it seemed to him no more than one of these recurrent quarrels with the mundane power of Rome, which all kings, and saints among them, had engaged in for many hundred years. All real powers thus conflict in all times. But had he known it, and he did not know it, the moment was fatally inopportune for playing that game. Henry never meant to break permanently with the unity of Christendom. A disruption of that unity was probably inconceivable to him. He meant to exercise pressure. All his acts, from the decisive proclamation of September 19th, 1530 onwards, prove it. But the moment was the moment of a breaking point throughout Europe, and he, Henry, blundered into disaster without knowing what the fullness of the moment was. He was devout, especially to the Blessed Sacrament. He kept the faith for himself, and he tried hard to keep it for others. But having lost unity, he let in what he loathed. Not so long as he lived could those doctrines of the Reformers triumph here. But he had compromised with their spirit, and at his death a strong minority, perhaps a tenth of England, more of London, was already hostile to the creed. It was the same thing with the suppression of the monasteries. Henry meant no effect on religion by that loot. He none the less destroyed it. He intended to enrich the crown. He ruined it. In the matter of their financial endowment, an economic crisis produced by the unequal growth of economic powers had made the monastic foundation ripe for resettlement. Religious orders were here wealthy without reason, poor in spirit and numbers, but rich in land; there impoverished without reason, rich in popularity and spiritual power, but poor in land. The dislocation which all institutions necessarily suffer on the economic side, through the mere efflux of time, inclined every government in Europe to a resettlement of religious endowment. Everywhere it took place, everywhere it involved dissolution and restoration. But Henry did not resettle. He plundered and broke. He used the contemporary idolatry of executive power just as much at Reading or in the Blackfriars of London, where unthinking and immediate popular feeling was with him, as at Glastonbury, where it was against him, as in Yorkshire, where it was in arms, as in Galway, where there was no bearing with it at all. There was no largeness in him, nor any comprehension of complexity. And when, in this Jacobin, unexampled way, he had simply got rid of that which he should have restored and transformed, Of what effect was that vast act of spoliation? It paralyzed the Church. It ultimately brought down the monarchy. From a fourth to a third of the economic power over the means of production in England, which had been vested top heavily in the religious foundations, here far too rich, there far too poor, Henry got by one enormous confiscation. Yet he made no permanent addition to the wealth of the Crown. On the contrary, he started its decline. The land passed by an instinctive multiple process, but very rapidly, to the already powerful class which had begun to dominate the villages. Then, when it was too late, the Tudors attempted to stem the tide, but the thing was done. Upon the indifference which is always common to a society long and profoundly Catholic and ignorant of heresy, or, having conquered heresy, ignorant at any rate of struggle for the faith, two ardent minorities converged. The small minority of confused enthusiasts who really did desire what they believed to be a restoration of primitive Christianity. The much larger minority of men now grown almost invincibly powerful in the economic sphere. The squires, 20 years after Henry's death, had come to possess, through the ruin of religion, something like half the land of England. With the rapidity of a fungus growth, the new wealth spread over the desolation of the land. The enriched captured both the universities, all the courts of justice, most of the public schools. They won their great civil war against the Crown. Within a century after Henry's folly, they had established themselves in the place of what had once been the monarchy and central government of England. The impoverished Crown resisted in vain. They killed one embarrassed king, Charles I, and they set up his son, Charles II, as an insufficiently salaried puppet. Since their victory over the Crown, they and the capitalists who have sprung from their avarice and their philosophy, and largely from their very loins, have been completely masters of England. The end of section 35. Section 36, Europe and the Faith. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Europe and the Faith by Hilaire Belloc. Section 36, Chapter 9, concluded. Here the reader may say, what? This large national movement to be interpreted as the work of such minorities? A few thousand squires and merchants backing a few more thousand enthusiasts changed utterly the mass of England? Yes. To interpret it otherwise is to read history backwards. It is to think that England then was what England later became. There is no more fatal fault in the reading of history, nor any illusion to which the human mind is more prone. To read the remote past in the light of the recent past, to think the process of one towards the other inevitable, to regard the whole matter as a slow, inexorable process independent of the human will, still suits the materialist pantheism of our time. There is an inherent tendency in all men to this fallacy of reading themselves into the past, and of thinking their own mood a consummation at once excellent and necessary, and most men who write of these things imagine a vaguely Protestant Tudor England growing consciously Protestant in the England of the Stuarts. That is not history. It is history to put yourself by a combined effort of reading and of imagination into the shoes of Tuesday, as though you did not know what Wednesday was to be, and then to describe what Tuesday was. England did not lose the faith in 1550 to 1620 because she was Protestant then. Rather, she is Protestant now because she then lost the faith. Put yourself into the shoes of a 16th century Englishman in the midst of the Reformation, and what do you perceive? A society wholly Catholic in tradition, lax and careless in Catholic practice, irritated or enlivened here and there by a few furious preachers or by a few enthusiastic scholars, at once devoted to and in terror of the civil government, intensely national, in all the roots and traditions of its civilization, Roman, impatient of the disproportion of society, and in particular of economic disproportion in the religious aspect of society, because the religious function, by the very definition of Catholicism, by its very creed, should be the first to redress tyrannies. Upon that Englishman comes first a mania for his king, next a violent economic revolution, which in many parts can be made to seem an approach to justice, finally a national appeal of the strongest kind against the encroaching power of Spain. When the work was done by, say, 1620, the communication between England and those parts of the ancient West which were still furiously resisting the storm was cut. No spiritual force could move England after the Armada and its effect, save what might arise spontaneously in the many excited men who still believed, they continued to believe it for 50 years, that the whole Church of Christ had gone wrong for centuries, that its original could be restored, and that personal revelations were granted them for their guidance. These visionaries were the Reformers. To these, souls still athirst for spiritual guidance turned. They were a minority even at the end of the 16th century, the last years of Elizabeth, but they were a minority full of initiative and of action. With the turn of the century, 1600 to 1620, the last men who could remember Catholic training were very old or dead. The new generation could turn to nothing but the new spirit. For authority it could find nothing definite but a printed book, a translation of the Hebrew Scriptures. For teachers, nothing but this minority, the Reformers. That minority, though remaining a minority, leavened and at last controlled the whole nation. By the first third of the 17th century, Britain was utterly cut off from the unity of Christendom, and its new character was sealed. The Catholic faith was dead. The governing class remained largely indifferent, as it still is, to religion, yet it remained highly cultured. The populace drifted here into complete indifference, there into orgiastic forms of worship. The middle class went over in a solid body to the enemy. The barbarism of the outer Germanies permeated it and transformed it. The closer reasoned, far more perverted and harder French heresy of Calvin partly deflected the current, and a whole new society was formed and launched. That was the English Reformation. Its effect upon Europe was stupendous, for though England was cut off, England was still England. You could not destroy in a Roman province the great traditions of municipality and letters. It was as though a phalanx of trained troops had crossed the frontier in some border war and turned against their former comrades. England lent, and has from that day continuously lent, the strength of a great civilized tradition to forces whose original initiative was directed against European civilization and its tradition. The loss of Britain was the one great wound in the body of the Western world. It is not yet healed. Yet all this, while that other island of the group to the northwest of Europe, that island which had never been conquered by armed civilization, as were the outer Germanies, but had spontaneously accepted the faith, presented a contrasting exception. Against the loss of Britain, which had been a Roman province, the faith, when the smoke of battle cleared off, could discover the astonishing loyalty of Ireland. And over against this exceptional province, Britain, now lost to the faith, lay an equally exceptional and unique outer part which had never been a Roman province, yet which now remained true to the tradition of Roman men. It balanced the map like a counterweight. The efforts to destroy the faith in Ireland have exceeded in violence, persistence and cruelty any persecution in any part or time of the world. They have failed. As I cannot explain why they have failed, so I shall not attempt to explain how and why the faith in Ireland was saved when the faith in Britain went under. I do not believe it capable of an historic explanation. It seems to me a phenomenon essentially miraculous in character, not generally attached, as are all historical phenomena, to the general and divine purpose that governs our large political events, but directly and specially attached. It is of great significance how great men will be able to see many years hence, when another definite battle is joined between the forces of the Church and her opponents. For the Irish race alone of all Europe has maintained a perfect integrity, and has kept serene, without internal reactions and without their consequent disturbances, the soul of Europe, which is the Catholic Church. I have now nothing left to set down but the conclusion of this disaster, its spiritual result, an isolation of the soul, its political result, a consequence of the spiritual, the prodigious release of energy, the consequent advance of special knowledge, the domination of the few under a competition left unrestrained, the subjection of the many, the ruin of happiness, the final threat of chaos. The end of section 36. The end of chapter 9. Section 37. Europe and the Faith. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Europe and the Faith by Hilaire Belloc. Section 37, Chapter 10, Conclusion. The grand effect of the Reformation was the isolation of the soul. This was its fruit. From this all its consequences proceed. Not only those clearly noxious, which have put in jeopardy the whole of our traditions and all our happiness, but those apparently advantageous, especially in material things. The process cannot be seen to work if we take a particular date, especially too early a date, and call it the moment of the catastrophe. There was a long interval of confusion and doubt in which it was not certain whether the catastrophe would be final or no, in which its final form remained undetermined, and only upon the conclusion of which could modern Europe with its new divisions and its new fates be perceived clearly. The breach with authority began in the very first years of the 16th century. It is not until the middle of the 17th century, at least, and even somewhat later, that the new era begins. For more than 100 years, the conception of the struggle as an ecumenical struggle, as something affecting the whole body of Europe, continued. The general upheaval, the revolt which first shook the West in the early years of the 16th century, to take a particular year, the year 1517, concerned all our civilization, was everywhere debated, produced a universal reaction met by as universal a resistance for 3 generations of men. No young man who saw the first outbreak of the storm could imagine it, even in old age, as a disruption of Europe. No such man lived to see it more than halfway through. It was not until a corresponding date in the succeeding century, or rather later, not until Elizabeth of England and Henry IV of France were dead, and all the protagonists, the reformers on one side, Loyola, Neri on the other, long dead, not until the career of Richelieu in the one country and the beginning of an aristocratic parliament in England were apparent, that the Reformation could clearly be seen to have separated certain districts of our civilization from the general traditions of the whole, and to have produced in special regions and sections of society the peculiar Protestant type which was to mark the future. The work of the Reformation was accomplished, one may say, a little after the outbreak of the 30 Years' War. England in particular was definitely Protestant by the decade 1620-1630, hardly earlier. The French Huguenot body, though still confused with political effort, had come to have a separate and real existence at about the same time. The oligarchy of Dutch merchants had similarly cut off their part of the Low Countries from imperial rule and virtually established their independence. The North German principalities and sundry smaller states of the mountains, notably Geneva, had definitely received the new stamp. As definitely France, Bohemia, the Danube, Poland and Italy and all the south were saved. Though an armed struggle was long to continue, though the northern Germans were nearly recaptured by the imperial power and only saved by French policy, though we were to have a reflex of it here in the civil wars and the destruction of the crown, and though the last struggle against the Stuarts and the greater general war against Louis XIV were but sequels to the vast affair, yet the great consequence of that affair was fixed before these wars began. The first third of the 17th century launches a new epoch. From about that time there go forward upon parallel lines the great spiritual and consequent temporal processes of modern Europe. They have yet to come to judgment, for they are not yet fulfilled, but perhaps their judgment is near. These processes, filling the last 300 years, have been as follows. 1. A rapid extension of physical science, and with it of every other form of acquaintance with demonstrable and measurable things. 2. The rise, chiefly in the new Protestant part of Europe, but spreading thence in part to the Catholic, of what we call today capitalism, that is, the possession of the means of production by the few and their exploitation of the many. 3. The corruption of the principle of authority until it was confused with mere force. 4. The general, though not universal, growth of total wealth with the growth of physical knowledge. 5. The ever-widening effect of skepticism which, whether masked under traditional forms or no, was from the beginning a spirit of complete negation and led at last to the questioning not only of any human institutions, but of the very forms of thought and of the mathematical truths. 6. With all these, of course, we have a universal mark, the progressive extension of despair. Could anyone look back upon these 3 centuries from some very great distance of time, he would see them as an episode of extraordinary extension in things that should be disassociated. Knowledge and wealth on the one hand, the unhappiness of men upon the other, and he would see that, as the process matured, or rather as the corruption deepened, all its marks were pushed to a degree so extreme as to jeopardize at last the very structure of European society. Physical science acquired such power, the oppression of the poor was pushed to such a length, the reasoning spirit in man was permitted to attain such a tottering pitch of insecurity, that a question never yet put to Europe arose at last, whether Europe, not from external foes, but from her own inward lesion, may not fail. Corresponding to that terrible and as yet unanswered question, the culmination of so much evil, necessarily arises this sole vital formula of our time: Europe must return to the faith, or she will perish. I have said that the prime product of the Reformation was the isolation of the soul. That truth contains in its development very much more than its mere statement might promise. The isolation of the soul means a loss of corporate sustenance, of the sane balance produced by general experience, the weight of security, and the general will. The isolation of the soul is the very definition of its unhappiness. But this solvent applied to society does very much more than merely complete and confirm human misery. In the first place, and underlying all, the isolation of the soul releases in a society a furious new accession of force. The break-up of any stable system in physics, as in society, makes actual a prodigious reserve of potential energy. It transforms the power that was keeping things together with the power driving separately each component part, the effect of an explosion. That is why the Reformation launched the whole series of material advance, but launched it chaotically and on divergent lines which would only end in disaster. But the thing had many other results. Thus we next notice that the new isolation of the soul compelled the isolated soul to strong vagaries. The soul will not remain in the void. If you blind it, it will grope. If it cannot grasp what it appreciates by every sense, it will grasp what it appreciates by only one. On this account, in the dissolution of the corporate sense and of the corporate religion, You had successive idols set up, worthy and unworthy, none of them permanent. The highest and most permanent was the reaction towards corporate life in the shape of a worship of national patriotism. You had at one end of the scale an extraordinary new tabus, the erection in one place of a sort of maniac god, bloodthirsty, an object of terror; in another, or in the same, a curious new ritual observance of nothingness upon every seventh day; in another, an irrational attachment to particular printed book; in another, successive conceptions: first, that the human reason was sufficient for the whole foundations of human life, that there were no mysteries; next, the opposite extravagance, that the human reason had no authority even in its own sphere. And these two, though contradictory, had one root: the rationalism of the 18th century carried on through the materialism of the 19th, the irrational doubts of Kant, which include much emotional rubbish, carried on to the sheer chaos of the latter metaphysicians with their denial of contradictions and even of being. Both sprang from this necessity of the unsupported soul to make itself some system from within, as the unsupported soul, in an evil dream, now stifles in strict confinement and is next dissolved in some fearful emptiness. All this, the first interior effect of the Reformation, strong in proportion to the strength of the reforming movement, powerful in the regions or sects which had broken away, far less powerful in those which had maintained the faith, would seem to have run its full course, and to have settled at last into universal negation and a universal challenge preferred to every institution and every postulate. But since humanity cannot repose in such a stage of anarchy, we may well believe that there is coming, or has already begun, yet another stage in which the lack of corporate support for the soul will breed attempted strange religions, witchcrafts and necromancies. It may be so. It may be that the great debate will come up for final settlement before such novel diseases spread far. At any rate, for the moment we are clearly in a stage of complete negation. But it is to be repeated that this breaking up of the foundations differs in degree with varying societies, that still, in a great mass of Europe, numerically the half perhaps, the necessary anchors of sanity still hold, and that half is the half where directly by the practice of the faith, or indirectly through a hold upon some part of its tradition, the Catholic Church exercises an admitted or distant authority over the minds of men. The end of section 37. Section 38. Europe and the Faith. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Europe and the Faith by Hilaire Belloc. Section 38, Chapter 10, concluded. The next process we note is by what some may think a paradox, also due to the isolation of the soul. It is the process of increasing knowledge. Men acting in a fashion highly corporate will not so readily question, nor therefore so readily examine, as will men acting alone. Men whose major results are taken upon an accepted philosophy will not be driven by such a need of inquiry as those who have abandoned that guide. In the moment, more than 1,000 years ago, when the last of the evangelizing flood tide was still running strongly, a very great man wrote of the physical sciences. Upon such toys I wasted my youth. And another wrote, speaking of divine knowledge, all the rest is smoke. But in the absences of faith, demonstrable things are the sole consolation. There are three forms in which the human mind can hold the truth. The form of science, which means that we accept a thing through demonstration and therefore cannot admit the possibility of its opposite. The form of opinion, which means that we accept a thing through probability, that is through a partial but not complete demonstration, and therefore we do not deny the possibility of the opposite. The form of faith where we accept a thing without demonstration and yet deny the possibility of its opposite, as for instance the faith of all men, not mad, in the existence of the universe about them and of other human minds. When acknowledged and defined, faith departs. It is clear that of the remaining two rivals, opinion has no ground against science. That which can be demonstrated holds all the field. Indeed, it is the mark of modern insufficiency that it can conceive of no other form of certitude save certitude through demonstration, and therefore does not as a rule appreciate even its own unproved first principles. Well, this function of the isolated soul, inquiry and the necessity for demonstration, for individual conviction through measurement and physical fixed knowledge, has occupied, as all know, the 3 modern centuries. We all are equally familiar with its prodigious results. Not one of them has as yet added to human happiness. Not one but has been increasingly misused to the misery of man. There is in the tragedy something comic also, which is the perpetual puzzlement of these the very authors of discovery, to find that somehow or other discovery alone does not create joy, and that somehow or other a great knowledge can be used ill, as anything else can be used ill. Also in their bewilderment many turn to a yet further extension of physical science as promising in some illogical way relief. A progression in physical science and in the use of instruments is so natural to man, so long as civic order is preserved, that it would indeed have taken place not so rapidly but as surely had the unity of Europe been preserved. But the destruction of that unity totally accelerated the pace, and as totally threw the movement off its rails. The Renaissance, a noble and vividly European thing, was much older than the Reformation, which was its perversion and corruption. The doors upon modern knowledge had been opened before the soul which was to enter them had been cut off from its fellows. We owe the miscarriage of all our great endeavour in this field not to that spring of endeavour but to its deflection. It is a blasphemy to deny the value of advancing knowledge, and at once a cowardice and a folly to fear it for its supposed consequences. Its consequences are only evil through an evil use, that is, through an evil philosophy. In connection with this release of powerful inquiry through the isolation of the soul, you have an apparently contradictory and certainly supplementary effect: the setting up of unfounded external authority. It is a curious development, one very little recognized, but one which a fixed observance of the modern world will immediately reveal. And those who come to see it are invariably astonished at the magnitude of its action. Men, under the very influence of skepticism, have come to accept almost any printed matter, almost any repeated name, as an authority infallible and to be admitted without question. They have come to regard the denial of such authority as a sort of insanity, or rather they have, in most practical affairs, come to be divided into 2 groups: a small number of men who know the truth, say upon a political matter or some financial arrangement or some unsolved problem, and a vast majority which accept without question and always incomplete a usually quite false statement of the things, because it has been repeated in the daily press and vulgarized in 100 books. This singular and fantastic result of the long divorce between the non-Catholic mind and reason has profound effect upon the modern world. Indeed, the great battle about to be engaged between chaos and order will turn largely upon this form of suggestion, this acceptation of an unfounded and irrational authority. Lastly, there is, of the major consequences of the Reformation, that phenomenon which we have come to call capitalism, and which many, recognizing its universal evil, wrongly regard as the prime obstacle to right settlement of human society and to the solution of our now intolerable modern strains. What is called capitalism arose directly in all its branches from the isolation of the soul. That isolation permitted an unrestricted competition. It gave to superior cunning, and even to superior talent, an unchecked career. It gave every license to greed, and on the other side it broke down the corporate bonds whereby men maintained themselves in an economic stability. Through it there arose in England, first later throughout the more active Protestant nations, and later still in various degrees throughout the rest of Christendom, a system under which a few possessed the land and the machinery of production, and the many were gradually dispossessed. The many thus dispossessed could only exist upon doles meted out by the possessors. Nor was human life a care to these. The possessors also mastered the state and all its organs, hence the great national debts which accompanied the system, hence even the financial hold of distant and alien men upon subject provinces of economic effort, hence the draining of wealth not only from increasingly dissatisfied subjects overseas, but from the individual producers of foreign independent states. The true conception of property disappears under such an arrangement, and you naturally get a demand for relief through the denial of the principle of ownership altogether. Here again, as in the matter of the irrational taboos and of skepticism, two apparently contradictory things have one root: capitalism and the ideal inhuman system, not realizable, called socialism. Both spring from one type of mind, and both apply to one kind of diseased society. Against both, the pillar of reaction is peasant society, and peasant society has proved throughout Europe largely coordinate with the remaining authority of the Catholic Church. For a peasant society does not mean a society composed of peasants, but one in which modern industrial capitalism yields to agriculture, and in which agriculture is in the main conducted by men possessed in part or altogether of their instruments of production and of the soil, either through ownership or customary tenure. In such a society all the institutions of the state repose upon an underlying conception of secure and well divided private property, which can never be questioned and which colors all men's minds. And that doctrine, like every other sane doctrine, though applicable only to temporal conditions, has the firm support of the Catholic Church. So things have gone. We have reached at last, as the final result of that catastrophe 300 years ago, a state of society which cannot endure, and a dissolution of standards, a melting of the spiritual framework, such that the body politic fails. Men everywhere feel that an attempt to continue down this endless and ever darkening road is like the piling up of debt. We go further and further from a settlement. Our various forms of knowledge diverge more and more. Authority, the very principle of life, loses its meaning, and this awful edifice of civilization which we have inherited and which is still our trust, trembles and threatens to crash down. It is clearly insecure. It may fall at any moment. We who still live may see the ruin. But ruin, when it comes, is not only a sudden, it is also a final thing. In such a crux there remains the historical truth that this, our European structure, built upon the noble foundations of classical antiquity, was formed through, exists by, is consonant to, and will stand only in the mold of the Catholic Church. Europe will return to the faith or she will perish. The faith is Europe, and Europe is the faith. The end of section 38. The end of chapter 10. The end of Europe and the Faith by Hilaire Belloc.